The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windshield in a relentless rhythm as my headlights sliced through the dense fog. The road beneath me was little more than a ribbon of cracked asphalt, twisting through endless miles of forest that loomed on either side, dark and oppressive. The trees seemed closer here, their branches clawing at the sky, slick with rain, like blackened bones reaching for something unseen. The letter had been simple, a plea written in shaky black ink, scrawled onto brittle paper that felt older than it should have been. Come to Gravesmore. Help us before it's too late. That was all it said. No signature. No explanation. Just an address scribbled beneath it, 13 Hollow Lane. And now, here I was, deep in the middle of nowhere, chasing a town that didn't appear on any map. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as I glanced at the clock. 11:57 p.m. The woods on either side of me were suffocating. My high beams barely penetrated the murk, the fog swirling like smoke as though it were alive. The GPS on my phone had cut out miles back, leaving me with nothing but silence and the vague directions I'd written on a napkin. Then I saw it. A sign appeared on the side of the road, its paint chipped and weathered, the letters barely legible in the gloom. Welcome to Gravesmore. I slowed the car as I passed it, my headlights sweeping across the jagged edges of the wood, as though someone had tried to tear it down but never finished the job. The town appeared out of the fog like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The houses were old, Victorian structures with peaked roofs and darkened windows that stared down at me like watchful eyes. Many were falling apart, their shutters hanging loose, paint peeling away in strips. The streets were empty, slick with rainwater that reflected the dim glow of gas lamps spaced along the sidewalks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one to see. My car crawled forward, the engine's low hum the only sound besides the rain. Hollow Lane wasn't hard to find. The road narrowed sharply, the houses pressing in closer, and there it was, 13 Hollow Lane. The house was a shadow. It loomed at the end of the street, set apart from the others, as though the ground itself had rejected it. The structure was tall and thin, its silhouette crooked against the night sky. The windows were black, devoid of light or life, and the front door hung slightly open, like it was waiting for me. I parked the car at the edge of the driveway, the engine shuddering as I killed it. For a moment I sat there, staring at the house through the rain-streaked windshield. The air inside the car felt heavy, pressing against my chest, as though the house itself were breathing. I stepped out into the rain, the cold biting through my coat. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I made my way up the narrow path toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground didn't want me to move forward. I hesitated at the threshold, the darkness beyond the door so absolute it felt like I was staring into an abyss. Something moved inside. It wasn't loud, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on an old wooden floor, but it was enough. My breath caught as I leaned forward, straining to see through the gap in the door. There was nothing, just darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small against the quiet. No answer. The door creaked louder than it should have as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, damp and stale, like rotting wood and something sharper, metallic. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath my weight, and pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a narrow entryway that opened into a large empty room beyond. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in long strips to reveal wood that was warped and cracked. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste, disturbed only by the rain dripping through a hole in the ceiling. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow, there and gone so fast I couldn't be sure it was real. I moved farther inside, my footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug stretched across the floor. The silence was unbearable, so complete it felt unnatural. Houses like this creaked and groaned with the wind, but here there was nothing, just me. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but it was there. A voice drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. I turned sharply, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it toward the sound. The beam landed on a staircase. The wood was rotted, the steps sagging beneath their own weight, but it led upward, vanishing into the dark. The whisper came again, clearer now. A single word, repeated over and over in a voice that sounded wrong. Help, help, help. My feet moved before I could stop them. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight tracing the walls as I went. Halfway up, I stopped. The whisper had changed. It was saying my name. Evelyn, Evelyn. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming for a moment before sputtering back to life. Something was waiting for me at the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors that loomed tall and narrow, their paint peeling like dead skin. The whispering had stopped, but I could feel it, something pressing against me, watching me from just beyond the edges of the light. I moved toward the nearest door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It turned too easily, the hinges groaning softly as I pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, but the walls were covered in writing. Black symbols had been scrawled across every inch of space, looping and jagged, like they'd been carved with something sharp. In the center of the room sat a small wooden chair, and on the chair was a doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring straight ahead. Its mouth was painted into a faint smile, and its hands rested in its lap, as though waiting for something. Then its head moved. It turned slowly, the crackling sound of porcelain grinding against itself filling the room as its empty eyes fixed on me. My flashlight flickered again, and the whisper returned, louder this time, everywhere at once. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall as the flashlight fell from my hands, spinning across the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but the whispering didn't stop. It rose into a roar, a chorus of voices overlapping and echoing through the room, as though the house itself was screaming. And then, everything went silent. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. The footsteps creaked closer, slow, deliberate, each step drawn out just enough to set my nerves on edge. My flashlight lay useless on the floor, its beam spinning in erratic circles as it rolled, carving brief glimpses of the room from the darkness. The doll still sat in its chair, unmoving, but its presence was suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear through the silence. The footsteps stopped at the threshold of the room. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt it, something there in the doorway, watching me. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, to move, to do something, but my legs wouldn't obey. The floor groaned, and then came the sound of breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, like something was gasping to stay alive. I turned toward the noise, forcing my body to respond. My hand fumbled against the floor, searching for the flashlight. The light spun to a stop, and the beam landed on the doorway. There was no one there. The hallway stretched beyond the threshold, dark and empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. That feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin, thick and heavy, pushing down on my shoulders. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, my hand trembling, as the beam cut through the dark. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice was so small, it barely sounded like mine. Nothing answered. The house was silent again. I turned back to the room, my gaze flicking to the chair. The doll was gone. The chair sat empty now, tilted just slightly to the side as though something had moved too quickly from it. My heart lurched. I swept the flashlight around the room, the beam quivering against the walls covered in their strange black symbols. The whispers began again, soft and faint, rising from somewhere I couldn't place. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. I backed into the hallway, my light shaking with every step. The sound was coming from deeper in the house. It moved through the walls, rising and falling like a chorus, growing louder with every inch I put between myself and the empty chair. The hallway stretched in both directions, longer than it had been before, the walls warping and twisting in the edges of my vision. I turned left, drawn toward a faint glow spilling through the crack of a door at the far end. It was the only light I'd seen in the house, and even though every part of me knew I shouldn't go toward it, I couldn't stop. The door opened on its own as I approached, groaning on its hinges. The room beyond was a kitchen, or what was left of one. Cabinets hung off their hinges, their paint flaking onto the floor. The countertops were littered with broken dishes and rusted utensils, the sink filled with a stagnant pool of dark water. The air here was worse, thick and humid, with a faint sour smell I couldn't place. The table in the center of the room caught my eye first. It was set for dinner, 4 plates arranged neatly, with silverware placed beside them and empty glasses waiting. But the food was wrong. The plates were covered in black sludge that oozed toward the edges like it was still alive. Flies crawled across the surface, their wings buzzing faintly in the silence. And then I noticed the figures. 4 chairs sat around the table, and in each chair sat a shape, covered completely in sheets of heavy yellowed fabric. They were slumped forward, their hands resting on their laps, their heads tilted just slightly downward. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were watching me. The whispering grew louder now, filling the room, coming from them. Sit, sit. I stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the counter, my flashlight flickering in my hand. One of the figures shifted. The fabric covering it sagged, a faint rustling sound spilling from underneath. Stop, I choked, my voice shaking. Please, stop. The whispering didn't stop. I turned and bolted, the flashlight swinging wildly as I crashed back into the hallway. The house groaned around me, floorboards creaking, walls rattling, as though it was alive and angry. I ran toward the stairs, my breath ragged, my hands slipping along the banister as I climbed. The whispers followed me, rising into a roar that seemed to crawl inside my head, into my bones. At the top of the stairs, I slammed into a closed door at the end of the hallway. My fingers fumbled against the handle, turning it just as the whispering reached its peak. One word echoing louder than the rest. Stay. The door flew open, and I fell through. I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs as I hit the wooden floor. The door slammed shut behind me, and the whispering stopped. Silence dropped over the room like a weight. I pushed myself upright, coughing as I looked around. It was an attic. The ceiling sloped low, the wooden beams exposed and splintered. Old boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly along the walls, their lids cracked open, spilling yellowed papers and faded photographs onto the floor. A single window sat at the far end, cracked and streaked with grime, the faint light of the moon seeping through. In the center of the room stood a mirror. It was tall and ornate, its frame carved with twisting patterns that looked like vines or roots. The glass was dark, too dark, like the surface of water just before it pulls you under. I stepped closer. My reflection appeared, but something was wrong. The version of me in the mirror wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, staring back at me with wide, glassy eyes. Its mouth twitched, pulling into the faintest hint of a smile, and then its head tilted to the side in that same unnatural way. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as the reflection stepped forward. The glass didn't break. It didn't shatter. It rippled, soft and slow, like water, as the figure in the mirror pushed through. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and broken, its face wearing my features but not my expression. It grinned at me, its teeth too sharp, too white, its eyes black pits that seemed to stretch endlessly. It whispered in my voice, soft and hollow, "You shouldn't have come here." The light flickered and went out. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and absolute, as though the room itself had swallowed the light. I couldn't see anything, not the mirror, not the warped floor beneath me, only blackness stretching in every direction. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, echoing off unseen walls. I felt unmoored, weightless, like I might drift away if I wasn't careful. Then, a sound. Faint at first, a slow, wet drip, drip. Each drop hit the floor with deliberate precision, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, to convince myself it was just water, a leak in the rotting ceiling above me. But I knew better. I fumbled with the flashlight in my hands, my fingers numb and shaking as I clicked the switch. Nothing. I shook it desperately, the casing rattling as though something inside had broken. Drip, dot, drip, tight. The noise was louder now, closer. I'd feel it just behind me, at the edges of the dark, where the silence waited to pounce. I spun around, blind and frantic, my boots scraping against the splintered wood. The flashlight sputtered suddenly, its beam flickering weakly to life. The attic came back into view, the beam cutting through a thin haze of dust that hung in the air like smoke. I froze. The mirror was still there, looming at the center of the room. Its surface was no longer still. The glass rippled like liquid, tiny waves spreading outward from where I had last seen the thing that wore my face. But now, the surface was empty. My reflection was gone. The light sputtered again, and my pulse stuttered with it. I scanned the room, my breathing ragged. The boxes stacked against the walls seemed closer now, their shadows deeper, stretching long across the floorboards like they were reaching for me. I turned back toward the mirror. A hand pressed against the inside of the glass. It appeared out of nowhere, thin, pale fingers splayed wide, the skin cracked and gray like something long dead. I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam trembling as I pointed it at the mirror. The hand pushed harder, the surface of the glass bending beneath its weight like elastic. Cracks, spiderwebbed outward with a sharp pop, 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 dot-a-dot-o. It was coming through. I didn't wait to see it happen. I bolted for the attic door, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I ran. The floor groaned beneath my weight, boards shifting and sagging like they might give way at any second. Behind me I heard it, the splintering of glass, a wet, slithering sound like something dragging itself free. The door was stuck. I grabbed the handle and yanked it hard, my hands slick with sweat, my chest heaving. The whispers began again, rising from all around me. A chorus of voices repeating the same word over and over. Stay, 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 I. The door burst open, and I stumbled forward into the hallway. I slammed it shut behind me, my back pressing against the wood as I gasped for air. My flashlight's beam jittered across the walls, the shadows warping and bending as though alive. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed through the house now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore, only that they were getting louder. I turned to run. The hallway stretched on endlessly in both directions, far longer than it had been when I first climbed the stairs. Doors lined the walls, each one identical, their handles rusted, the paint peeling in thin curling strips. At the far end, I could see the faint outline of something, a shape moving slowly toward me, its limbs jerking in awkward, unnatural angles. I didn't wait. I bolted the other way, the flashlight's beam bouncing across the walls as I ran. My boots pounded against the floor, the sound swallowed by the whispers that grew louder with every step. My heart felt like it would explode. The hallway twisted suddenly, and I skidded around a corner, nearly crashing into another door, a large, ornate thing that looked far older than the rest. Unlike the others, it was untouched by decay. The wood was polished, the brass handle gleaming faintly in the flickering light. It felt wrong. Too perfect. The whispers stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The house was silent now, so quiet it hurt my ears. I glanced over my shoulder, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of the figure I'd seen before, crawling slowly around the far corner. It was closer now. Too close. I turned the handle and shoved the door open. Inside was darkness, thick and heavy, like ink. I stepped through before I could stop myself, the door swinging shut behind me with a dull, final thud. The flashlight flickered as I lifted it, the beam struggling to cut through the dark. The room was massive, far larger than it should have been, its ceiling lost somewhere above me. Rows of wooden pews stretched out in neat, uniform lines, their surfaces slick with dust. At the far end of the room, an altar stood beneath a massive, stained glass window. The glass was black now, its patterns twisted into something jagged and unrecognizable. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I moved closer, the air thick and freezing. Something stood at the altar. It was hunched over, its back to me, its silhouette almost human but wrong. Its shoulders jutted out at sharp angles, its arms too long, its head lolling to the side as though it were broken. My breath caught in my throat as I edged closer, my boots dragging across the dusty floor. "Hello? Oh?" I whispered. The figure twitched. Slowly, its head turned, and I saw its face. No, my face, stretched and distorted, its mouth pulled into that same jagged grin. Its hollow eyes stared through me, black and endless, and it whispered in a voice that scraped against my ears like rusted metal. "You shouldn't have come here." The flashlight sputtered out. Darkness swallowed me whole. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air like a storm. I stumbled back, the ground shifting beneath my feet, my hands outstretched to steady myself. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, a mirror. The glass was liquid beneath my touch, rippling outward. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, and the last thing I heard before the dark consumed me was my own voice, whispering softly in my ear, "Stay." The darkness was suffocating, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything beyond the faint thrum of blood pounding in my ears. My feet scraped across the uneven floor as I staggered forward, hands outstretched, searching for something, anything, to ground me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence that felt worse. It wasn't empty. It was alive, full of something I couldn't name. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cold surface of a wall. Stone, maybe. The texture was strange, slick, like it had been sweating in the dark. Then a sound, a low, hollow creak, coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The air felt heavier now, thick with a damp chill that settled into my lungs with every breath. I turned the flashlight in my hands, shaking it once, twice, until it flickered back to life. The beam cut through the dark, and I found myself standing in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with mirrors. Each mirror was different, some cracked, their glass splintered into jagged patterns like spider webs. Others were pristine, their frames carved with twisting vines and strange symbols I didn't recognize. The mirrors stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the gloom, their reflections dancing uneasily in the flickering light. I took a step forward, and the sound of my boots echoed strangely, too loud against the silence. My reflection moved with me, its outline sharp and clear in the nearest mirror. But something about it was wrong. It wasn't immediate, but as I stared at it, I noticed the details. The way its mouth twitched at the corners, the slight delay in its movements, like it was mimicking me instead of reflecting. I turned away quickly, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Don't look at them," I told myself. "Just keep moving." The hallway seemed endless. My flashlight flickered with every step, the beam growing weaker, the air colder. The mirrors lined both sides, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all filled with reflections that weren't quite right. Some were too tall. Some were too thin. In one, I could have sworn I saw myself standing still while I kept walking. Then I saw it. A shape in the mirror, not me, just behind my shoulder, moving closer. I spun around, the flashlight beam slashing through the dark. The hallway behind me was empty, but the mirror still held the shadow, a tall, thin figure with its head bent at an unnatural angle, its arms stretched too long, fingers trailing like sharp wires. My breath caught as the figure stepped closer. Inside the glass, its face came into focus, smooth, pale, and featureless except for the mouth, grinning, sharp, and jagged. I stumbled backward, the beam shaking violently. The figure didn't move, but the reflection rippled like water, distorting everything around it. I turned and ran, my boots slamming against the ground, each step echoing louder and louder, like the house itself was chasing me. The mirrors reflected flashes of me as I passed, distorted, laughing, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I just ran until the hallway ended and I crashed into a heavy wooden door. I shoved it open and stumbled inside, slamming it behind me. My flashlight flickered and went out. The room was dark and silent. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, my palms slick with sweat. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere far off, as though the house itself was still alive, still moving. I fumbled for the flashlight again, clicking it until the beam flared weakly to life. The light revealed the space around me, another room, but different. Larger. I was standing in what looked like a chapel. Wooden pews stretched out in neat rows, their surfaces warped and rotting, as though they'd been left to decay for centuries. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its edges carved with strange symbols identical to those on the mirrors. Above it hung a massive stained glass window. The glass was shattered. Where light should have spilled in, there was only darkness beyond. Something moved in that darkness, shadows shifting like oil pooling against the edges of the frame. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I stepped forward, the floor creaking loudly beneath me. As I approached the altar, I saw it. A book. It was massive, its leather cover cracked and blackened, edges curling like it had been burned. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift when I looked at them, twisting into patterns that made my head ache. I reached for it, hesitating just inches from the cover. The air felt colder here, heavier, as though the room were holding its breath. I didn't want to touch it. Then I heard the voice. "Read it." The whisper came from everywhere at once, curling through the air like smoke, soft and sickly sweet. I turned sharply, scanning the dark corners of the room, but I was alone. The voice came again, closer this time. "Read it." I looked back at the book. My hands moved on their own, shaking as they closed around the edges of the cover. The leather was cold against my skin, wet, like it was still alive. I opened it slowly, the spine groaning, the pages brittle and stained with dark streaks that looked too much like blood. The symbols filled the pages, jagged lines and circles, twisting into impossible shapes that seemed to sink into the paper itself. As I stared at them, they began to move. They crawled across the pages, shifting like insects scattering beneath a stone. I couldn't stop reading. The words poured into me, words I couldn't understand but felt somewhere deep inside, like they had been waiting for me to find them. My head throbbed, my vision blurring, but I kept reading. The voice grew louder, whispering the words alongside me. "Bring it back. Open the way." The shadows in the broken window began to move. I could feel them seeping into the room, coiling along the walls, stretching toward me like fingers. The symbols on the pages burned brighter, the black ink glowing faintly red. The ground beneath me shifted, and I looked up. The figure from the mirror was standing at the far end of the chapel, its grin stretching impossibly wide, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The voice spoke one last time, soft and final. "It's time." The stained glass window shattered. A wave of darkness poured through, slamming into me with the force of a hurricane. I was thrown backward, the book flying from my hands as the air turned cold, and sharp. The room roared with sound, whispers, screams, the groaning of the house as the shadows flooded in. And then, silence. I opened my eyes slowly, gasping for breath. I was lying on the cold, damp floor of the chapel, the broken window stretching high above me. The book was gone. The shadows were gone. But I wasn't alone. The figure was standing just feet away now, its grin splitting wider, its head tilted as it whispered softly, "Welcome home." The figure didn't move. It stood there, silhouetted against the jagged shards of the broken window, its head tilted just enough to make it wrong. Its grin was carved across its face, splitting impossibly wide, as though the skin would tear at any second. I wanted to scream, to bolt toward the door, to force my legs to obey, but I couldn't move. I was frozen beneath that hollow, endless stare. "Welcome home." The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling in an empty room, soft but final. The figure took a step toward me. It didn't walk. It slid forward, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by unsure hands. Its shadow stretched long across the floor, the edges bleeding into the cracks in the wood, as though it wasn't just darkness, but something alive. I pushed myself upright, the chill of the floor biting through my palms, and stumbled backward. My hands hit the nearest pew, the rotted wood snapping under my weight. The sound was sharp in the silence, and for a moment, the figure stopped. Its head snapped upright, almost too quickly, and the grin widened further, if that was even possible. The room began to tremble. The walls groaned as though something massive and ancient was shifting just beyond them. I could hear it, the low, resonant sound of breathing, a slow, rhythmic exhale, like the house itself was alive, and I had disturbed it. "Get out," I whispered to myself, forcing my legs to move. I turned and bolted. My boots skidded across the wooden floor, sending up clouds of dust as I sprinted toward the door. The whispers rose again, their chorus wrapping around me like invisible hands, clawing at my skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. The door was further than I remembered, like the room had stretched itself while I wasn't looking. My pulse roared in my ears, my chest burning with each gasping breath. Behind me, I heard it, footsteps. Not the heavy thud of someone running, but a soft, wet slapping sound, like bare feet dragging across stone. It was close. Too close. The door loomed ahead, its surface warped and splintered. I reached for the handle, my fingers stretching out. A hand gripped my shoulder. It wasn't a hand. It was cold and brittle, like bone wrapped in damp paper, its fingers impossibly long, curling against my skin. I screamed and wrenched myself free, spinning around, the flashlight flickering weakly as I swung it wildly. The figure was inches from me now. Its face, my face, was pale and smooth, its eyes nothing but black holes that stretched endlessly inward. It tilted its head again, that broken, unnatural movement, and whispered in my voice, "You can't leave." The floor beneath me splintered. A fissure spread outward from where the figure stood, jagged cracks splitting through the wood like lightning. Darkness bubbled up through the cracks, thick and oily, spreading like ink across the floor. The chapel shook violently. The pews toppled, the walls shuddering as if something was clawing at them from the other side. A deafening groan filled the air, the sound vibrating through my bones. I staggered backward, my flashlight falling from my hands as the ground shifted beneath me. The figure's shadow began to melt. It bled outward, stretching in every direction, creeping along the floor and up the walls. I turned and ran again, my feet slipping as the floor sagged beneath me, the cracks spreading faster. I threw my weight against the door, and it burst open with a sound like breaking glass. I stumbled into the hallway, collapsing to my knees as the door slammed shut behind me. My hands shook violently as I pushed myself up, gasping for air. The whispers were gone. The tremors had stopped. But the house was different now. The hallway was longer. The walls warped and swollen as though the house itself was breathing. The wallpaper had begun to peel away in strips, revealing something beneath, dark, pulsing veins that throbbed faintly with every heartbeat I took. I ran my hand along the wall, expecting wood plaster, but the surface was warm. I snatched my hand back and staggered forward, my only thought to find a way out. The hallway stretched endlessly, each door identical to the last. I asked them quickly, my breath catching in my throat as I heard faint sounds behind them. Soft crying, distant scratching, the low hum of something alive but unseen. Then I saw the door at the end of the hall. It was different, taller, older. Its surface was carved with the same symbols I'd seen in the chapel and on the book, twisting and looping like they'd been burned into the wood. A faint red light seeped through the cracks around the frame, pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to find another way. But something pulled me toward it, an invisible hand pressing against my back, pushing me forward. I gripped the handle. It was ice cold, sending a jolt up my arm that made my teeth ache. I turned it slowly, the door creaking open on its own, revealing a stairwell that spiraled downward into the dark. The red light came from somewhere far below, casting faint shadows across the walls. The air that rose up to meet me was damp and sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and something metallic. I looked over my shoulder one last time. The hallway was gone. There was nothing behind me but blackness. With nowhere else to go, I stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and I froze, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I took another step, then another. The whispers began again, rising up from the depths. Soft and distant at first, but growing louder with every step I took until they surrounded me, repeating the same word over and over. Down, down, down. The stairs spiraled endlessly, the red light glowing brighter as I descended. My hands brushed against the walls for balance, and I felt it again, that pulsing warmth, the veins beneath the surface moving faintly, like they were alive. Finally, I reached the bottom. I stepped into a cavernous room, its ceiling lost to shadow. The walls were slick and black, pulsing with the same red light that emanated from the center of the room. There, in a massive pit carved into the stone, lay something I couldn't fully comprehend. A shape, shifting and writhing, endless and impossible. It turned toward me, and in that moment, I understood. The house hadn't called me here. It had. It had been waiting. The thing in the pit was breathing. Each slow exhale shuddered through the cavern, rattling the walls and vibrating in my chest like a drumbeat. I couldn't see all of it, couldn't comprehend its full shape, but the parts I could see were enough. It moved like liquid, its surface shifting and writhing in constant, unnatural motion. Dark tendrils slithered across the stone floor, pulsating faintly as they reached outward, searching. The red light poured from its center, throbbing in time with the deep echoing hum that filled the air. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey me. The cavern stretched around us like a cathedral, its walls slick and black, covered in jagged carvings that seemed to shimmer in the pulsing glow. The symbols I'd seen before, the ones in the chapel, on the book, covered every inch of stone, glowing faintly as though they were alive. The thing shifted again, and a sound escaped from deep within it, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down my spine. My breath hitched, my knees threatening to buckle as the weight of it pressed down on me. I could feel it in my bones, in my skull, like it was burrowing into my mind. It knows I'm here. The thought burned through me like fire, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to move. I needed to get out. But the cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, and the red light made the shadows dance in strange patterns, like they were alive. Then I heard it. A voice. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, low and soft, curling around me like smoke. Evelyn. I flinched, my name echoing off the cavern walls. I tried to move backward, but my feet wouldn't budge. The stone floor felt like it had melted beneath me, rooting me in place. You've come so far. The voice didn't sound human. It was too deep, too smooth, like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. My name slid from its mouth with unnatural familiarity, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The tendrils moved closer. One of them slithered across the floor, stopping just inches from my boots. It hovered there, twitching faintly, before it began to rise. I watched in horrified silence as it stretched upward, twisting and coiling until it formed a shape, a hand. Long, spindly fingers curled slowly, beckoning me forward. Come closer. I shook my head, a choked noise escaping my throat. No. The voice hummed, a low vibration that made the air tremble. The hand twitched, its blackened surface rippling like oil on water. You don't have a choice. A scream rose in my chest, but before I could make a sound, the cavern shifted. The walls groaned, the cymbals pulsing brighter, and the ground beneath me moved. The stone rippled like liquid, waves spreading outward as the red light flared violently. The tendril hand shot forward, wrapping around my ankle. Cold. It was so cold. The touch burned like ice, spreading up my leg as I screamed and kicked at it. My boot connected with the tendril, and it shattered, pieces of it splintering into the air like shards of glass. The hum faltered, the cavern trembling as though the thing in the pit had recoiled. I didn't wait. My body was moving, before I'd even processed it, my legs dragging me backward, toward a narrow gap in the wall I hadn't noticed before. The opening was jagged and uneven, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was there. My only way out. Behind me, the rumbling grew louder. The red light flared, and I could feel it. The thing rising from the pit, stretching toward me. A sound filled the air, shrill and high-pitched, like the screech of metal being torn apart. You cannot leave. I didn't stop. I dove for the gap, my shoulder slamming into the stone as I forced myself through. The rock scraped against my skin, tearing fabric and flesh, but I didn't care. I clawed my way forward, the tunnel closing in around me, the hum vibrating through the walls like it was alive. The gap twisted and turned, narrowing so tightly I thought I might get stuck. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my hands slipping against the damp stone as I pulled myself forward. The red light still pulsed behind me, growing dimmer with every inch I put between myself and the cavern. And then, finally, I saw it, a faint sliver of darkness up ahead. An exit. I dragged myself through the last stretch of the tunnel, the rock scraping against my ribs, and tumbled out onto solid ground. The air was different here, cold and sharp, filled with the scent of rain and earth. I rolled onto my back, gasping for breath, as the tunnel behind me sealed itself with a sound like a thunderclap. I was outside. The sky above me was a flat, endless black, dotted with pinpricks of light that didn't look like stars. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, covered in damp grass that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was breathing. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my body trembling as I looked around. I wasn't in the forest. Not anymore. The house stood in front of me, its silhouette sharper now, more jagged against the unnatural sky. It looked wrong, like the angles of it didn't line up, the edges stretching too far, twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The windows were lit from within, their glow a deep, pulsing red that matched the light I'd seen in the cavern. Something was waiting for me inside. I could feel it pulling me forward, an invisible thread tightening around my chest, dragging me toward the front door. I didn't want to go, but there was nowhere else to run. The forest was gone, the land around me stretching into an empty void, endless and flat. The door was open, just a crack, spilling that same red light across the steps. I staggered toward it, my legs weak beneath me, my breath shallow as I reached the threshold. From somewhere deep inside the house, I heard a sound, soft and distant, like laughter echoing through empty halls. And then the voice came again, quiet this time, almost gentle. "Welcome back, Evelyn." The door yawned wide as I stepped inside, the red light swallowing me whole. It pulsed through the air, thick and heavy like fog, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs. The silence here was different, dense, alive, like it was waiting for something. For me. The house had changed again. The walls stretched higher, their edges jagged and uneven, and the hallway ahead of me seemed endless, bleeding into the dark. The light pooled in strange patterns across the floor, as though it couldn't decide which direction to go. I moved forward, my boots scraping softly against the warped wood. With each step, the air grew colder, the sound of my breathing too loud in my ears. I could feel the house watching me now, its presence pressing down on me from every direction. A door slammed somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, sharp and final. I stopped walking, my body rigid, every nerve on edge. The hallway was empty, but the shadows shifted at the corners of my vision, crawling along the walls like insects. "Come," the voice whispered. It was faint, carried through the air like a breeze, curling around me, slipping into my ears and under my skin. It wasn't coming from a direction I could follow. It was everywhere, buried in the walls, in the floors, inside me. "Where are you?" I choked out, my voice hoarse, cracking against the silence. The house answered. The hallway began to stretch, the floorboards groaning as the walls warped and twisted. I staggered, disoriented, as the corridor tilted beneath my feet. Doors slammed open on either side of me, one after another, bang, bang, the sound echoing endlessly. From inside those rooms, something moved, but I couldn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I ran. The hallway twisted and turned, folding in on itself like a maze. The light flickered wildly now, red and black bleeding together, until I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the walls began. My breath came in sharp bursts, my chest aching as I sprinted towards something, an opening ahead, a doorway bathed in a brighter glow, the only way forward. I burst through it and stumbled into the grand entryway of the house. The chandelier hung above me, its crystals warped and dripping with something thick and dark. The front door stood across the room, wide open now, the black void of the outside stretching beyond it. For a moment, hope flared in my chest, sharp and bright. I ran for it. The light shifted. The door snapped shut with a sound like cracking bones, the walls around it rippling and sealing it into place. The hope died as quickly as it had come. I stopped short, my shoulders rising and falling with each breath, and turned around. The figure was there. It stood at the base of the staircase, its shadow stretching impossibly far across the floor, the edges curling upward like smoke. Its head tilted in that same unnatural way, and when it smiled, I could feel the grin cut through the air like a knife. "You brought yourself here," it said in my voice, hollow and broken. "No," I whispered, my throat dry. "No, I didn't." The figure raised a hand, long bony fingers that twitched slightly as it pointed toward me. The air in the room shifted. The walls groaned, and the red light flared brighter, painting everything in its sickly glow. I could feel something beneath me, something massive, moving just below the surface of the house, breathing in time with the pulse of the light. "You don't remember," it said softly. The walls rippled, and images began to take shape, faint at first, like shadows, then sharper. I saw myself, standing in this very room, holding something in my hands. A book. The book. The memory slammed into me like a wave. I saw myself reading from its pages, the words crawling across the paper like insects, spilling from my mouth even though I didn't understand them. The ground split open. The red light poured through. The house breathed. I gasped, shaking my head. I didn't know. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate, its shadow reaching for me like outstretched arms. "You opened the way," it whispered, "and now you must finish it." The ground beneath me cracked, jagged lines spreading outward as the floor split open, revealing the same chasm I'd seen before, the pit where the thing writhed and waited. Tendrils rose from the darkness, reaching for me, curling around my ankles. I screamed, stumbling backward, my hands scrabbling against the splitting wood as the floor gave way beneath me. "Let me go," I shouted, tears burning my eyes. The figure loomed over me now, its face inches from mine. I could see the darkness inside it, an emptiness that stretched forever. It smiled, and I felt my chest tighten as it whispered one final time, "You are the key." The tendrils tightened, and I fell. The world dropped away, and I tumbled into the darkness, the red light burning behind my eyelids. My screams echoed into nothingness, swallowed by the void as the hum returned, deafening, endless. I hit the ground hard. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on cold, damp stone. I was back in the cavern, the pit yawning wide in front of me, the tendrils rising and falling like waves. The figure was gone, but its voice lingered, whispering softly in the back of my mind. "Finish it." The book sat at the edge of the pit, open, tight, waiting. I crawled toward it, my body shaking, my vision blurring with tears and exhaustion. The hum rattled through my skull, vibrating in my bones, growing louder with every inch I moved closer. My hands closed around the book's edges, the leather slick and wet beneath my fingers. I knew what I had to do. The words rose from the pages, black ink shifting and twisting as they etched themselves into my mind. I spoke them aloud, my voice trembling at first, then stronger as the hum roared around me. The cavern shook, the tendrils writhing violently, the red light flaring brighter than ever before. The thing in the pit screamed. The sound split through me like a blade, but I didn't stop. I read the words, forcing them out through gritted teeth, as the cavern collapsed around me, stone and dust raining down in torrents. The red light flickered, dimming as the pit began to close, the tendrils retreating into the void. The hum stopped. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. I opened my eyes and found myself alone. The cavern was gone. The house was gone. I was lying in the middle of the forest, the ground cold and wet beneath me, the night sky stretched endlessly above. I pushed myself upright, my body aching, my hands stained with black ink. The house was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing but trees and darkness, and the faint, distant sound of the wind. It was over. At least that's what I told myself. I stood, my legs unsteady, and started walking. The forest was quiet now, but as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just out of sight, watching me, waiting. And in the distance, carried on the breeze, I heard it, a whisper, "Welcome home." The bridge loomed before us, a jagged silhouette against the deepening night. The air around it was heavier, colder than the rest of the town, as though the bridge itself was pulling the warmth away, drawing us closer with its eerie stillness. We stood there, the five of us, shrouded in the thick fog that clung to the riverbanks like a living thing. I couldn't take my eyes off the span of crumbling wood and rusted metal, even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The silent crossing. That's what the locals called it, though no one ever explained why. It wasn't the kind of name you asked questions about. You just accepted it, the way you accepted the hushed tones and nervous glances of those who spoke of it. But now, standing at its edge, I understood. The bridge wasn't silent. Not really. There was a hum to it, faint but constant, vibrating through the soles of my boots and into my chest. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was something you felt, something that burrowed into your bones and refused to let go. The others hesitated, their silhouettes shifting uneasily in the fog. Ryan was the first to move, stepping onto the warped wooden planks with a forced bravado that didn't fool anyone. He turned back to us, a smirk on his face, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. His flashlight flickered as he swept the beam across the bridge, illuminating the twisted metal railings and the gaping holes in the wood beneath his feet. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum. He didn't wait for us to respond. He just kept walking, the faint creak of the planks beneath him growing softer with each step. I followed, my feet dragging as though the air itself was trying to hold me back. The hum grew louder as I stepped onto the bridge, the vibrations rippling through me like a second heartbeat. The wood felt wrong beneath my boots, softer than it should have been, almost spongy, as though the bridge had been alive once and was now rotting from the inside out. The others followed, one by one, their flashlights casting jittery beams of light through the fog. The river below was invisible, swallowed by the mist, but I could hear it, a slow, steady rush of water that didn't match the stillness around us. The hum was louder now, resonating in my chest, and I had to resist the urge to cover my ears. It wasn't a sound that could be blocked out. About halfway across, Ryan stopped. His flashlight beam wavered, and he turned slowly, his face pale and drawn. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice sharp and uneven. The rest of us froze, our breaths visible in the icy air. I strained to listen, but the only sounds were the hum of the bridge and the distant rush of the river. The fog swirled around us, thick and suffocating, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a shadow, faint and flickering, just beyond the edge of the bridge. "Keep moving," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. My own words sounded foreign to me, hollow and distant. I wasn't sure if I was talking to Ryan or to myself. He didn't move. None of us did. The silence stretched, oppressive and endless, until it was broken by a sound that made my stomach twist. A laugh. It was soft, almost childlike, but there was nothing innocent about it. It came from the fog, from the shadows beyond the bridge, and it was wrong. Too high, too sharp, like the sound of glass breaking. My flashlight shook as I swung the beam toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just mist and shadow. Ryan took a step back, his movements jerky, and panicked. "This is stupid," he said, his voice rising. "We shouldn't be here. The plank beneath him gave way. It happened too fast to process. One moment, he was standing there. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness below. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the fog, followed by a splash that was too faint, too distant, like it had come from miles away. And then, silence. "Ryan!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat before I could stop it. I dropped to my knees, my hands gripping the edge of the broken plank as I peered into the void below. But there was nothing. No sign of him. No sound of the river. Just the hum, louder now, filling my head with a relentless, pulsing rhythm. The others rushed to my side, their flashlights slicing through the fog, but it was useless. The darkness below was impenetrable, an endless void that swallowed everything. My chest heaved, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the realization hit me. He was gone. Not just lost. Gone. The laugh came again, closer this time. It echoed through the fog, bouncing off the metal railings and the crumbling planks, and I felt my stomach twist with a sickening dread. The shadows shifted, the mist curling around us like a living thing, and I knew we weren't alone. "Get off the bridge," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We scrambled to our feet, the planks groaning beneath us as we turned back the way we had come. But the path was gone. The bridge stretched endlessly into the fog, the far side hidden by the swirling mist. My heart sank as I realized the truth. We were trapped. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the wood, through my chest, through my skull. The laugh turned into a chorus, overlapping voices that rose and fell in a sickening harmony. And then, the shadows began to move. They slithered across the bridge, dark shapes that flickered and twisted, their forms too fluid, too unnatural. My flashlight flickered as I swung the beam toward them, but it did nothing. The light passed through them, illuminating nothing but empty air, and still they moved closer. The mist thickened, curling around my legs, and I felt the wood beneath me shift, as though the bridge itself was alive. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and reached for the others, but they were gone. Their flashlights had vanished, their voices drowned out by the hum and the laughter. I was alone. The shadows closed in, their forms taking shape, twisted, humanoid figures with hollow eyes and wide, toothless grins. They reached for me, their fingers long and skeletal, and I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose plank. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs, and for a moment, all I could do was lie there, staring up at the fog-choked sky. And then, the bridge began to collapse. The bridge groaned beneath me, a low guttural sound like something straining under an unbearable weight. I scrambled to my feet, the wood shifting under my boots as the shadows circled, their movements deliberate and unnervingly slow. My flashlight flickered again, the weak beam barely piercing the thick fog that now felt alive, clinging to me, wrapping around my ankles like it meant to drag me down. "Ryan!" I shouted again, though I already knew it was useless. His name was swallowed by the hum, the oppressive vibration that seemed to come from the bridge itself, growing louder, sharper, until it felt like my skull was splitting apart. The shadows moved closer, their forms distorting and twisting, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw faces in them. Familiar faces. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and ran. The planks beneath my feet creaked and splintered, each step sending a jolt of panic through me. The mist was so thick now that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the flashlight was nothing more than a faint glow in the choking fog. My lungs burned with every breath, the cold air slicing through me like broken glass. The bridge stretched endlessly in both directions, the far shore hidden by the swirling void. It didn't make sense. We hadn't walked that far onto the bridge. The other side should have been just ahead, but now it felt like I was running in place, the same twisted metal railings and broken planks repeating endlessly around me. And then the voices started. At first, they were faint, just whispers at the edge of hearing, mingling with the hum like threads in a dark tapestry. But they grew louder, clearer, until they filled the air, overlapping in a cacophony of anger and despair. "You shouldn't be here. It's too late. Run if you can." The last voice stopped me cold. It was Ryan's. It came from somewhere behind me, distant but unmistakable. My chest tightened, and I turned, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog. There was nothing there, just the endless mist, swirling and twisting. But the voice came again, closer this time. "Help me." I didn't want to believe it. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to get as far from this place as possible, but I couldn't. If there was even a chance, if he was still alive. The shadows moved again, their forms shifting like smoke caught in a draft. They clustered at the edges of the bridge, just out of reach, their hollow eyes watching. They weren't following me. They were guiding me. I stepped toward them, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The wood groaned louder beneath my weight, and the hum intensified, a sharp vibration that made my teeth ache. The air grew colder with each step, and I realized I couldn't feel my fingers anymore, the numbness creeping up my arms like frostbite. And then I saw it. The fog parted, just for a moment, and there he was, Ryan. He stood in the middle of the bridge, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. His flashlight hung limply at his side, the beam aimed at the ground, barely illuminating the space around him. "Ryan!" I called, my voice cracking. He didn't move. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the frost-covered planks, and reached out a hand. "Ryan, it's me. We have to go. This place isn't..." He turned. The air left my lungs in a rush, and for a moment, all I could do was stare. It was him. His face, his clothes, everything exactly as I remembered. But his eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too deep, like twin voids that pulled at my soul, threatening to drag me under. And his mouth, it stretched into a grin that didn't belong on his face, the corners pulling back too far, revealing teeth that were jagged and uneven, like shards of broken glass. "You came back," he said, his voice layered and fractured, like 100 voices speaking at once. "I knew you would." I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the planks. The beam spun wildly, casting distorted shadows that danced across the bridge. Ryan, or whatever was wearing his face, tilted his head, his grin widening as he took a step toward me. "You shouldn't have followed," he said, his voice soft, but filled with something sharp, something cruel. "It won't let you leave now." I tripped, my back slamming against the cold, rusted railing, and scrambled for the flashlight, my fingers fumbling against the slick wood. The shadows were closing in, their forms stretching and twisting, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words blending into a deafening roar. Ryan, or the thing pretending to be him, reached out, his hand impossibly long, his fingers bending at unnatural angles. "You were always going to come back," he said, the grin never faltering. "It's what it wanted." I grabbed the flashlight, the beam cutting across his face, and he recoiled, his grin faltering for the briefest of moments. The shadows surged forward, their forms wrapping around him, and his face twisted, the grin collapsing into a snarl. "It's too late," he said, his voice sharp and venomous. "You're already part of it." The bridge shuddered beneath me, the wood groaning and splintering, and the hum reached a fever pitch, drowning out everything else. The shadows swirled, merging into a single, massive shape that towered over me, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. And then the bridge gave way. The planks beneath me splintered and collapsed, and I fell, the air rushing past me as the shadows closed in. The cold was unbearable, a searing pain that burned and froze at the same time, and the voices rose into a crescendo, their words tearing through my mind like claws. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on the bridge anymore. The sky above was dark, starless, and the ground beneath me was cold and slick, covered in a thin layer of frost. The air was heavy, thick, with the scent of damp earth and decay. The bridge was gone. Ryan was gone, and I was alone. But the hum was still there, faint and constant, a reminder that the silent crossing wasn't done with me yet. The ground beneath me was slick with frost, the cold seeping through my clothes and into my skin as I sat there, dazed and shivering. The air was heavier here, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like I was inhaling shards of ice, each one sharper than the last. My fingers dug into the frozen earth, desperate for some sense of solidity, but even the ground felt wrong, too soft, too wet, like the entire world around me was slowly dissolving. The hum was quieter now, but it hadn't disappeared. It had become something subtler, more insidious, vibrating just beneath the surface of everything. I could feel it in my bones, a faint pulse that refused to let go. The fog was still here too, thicker than before, swirling lazily around me in patterns that didn't feel entirely random. It moved with purpose, curling and shifting like it was alive. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its skeletal trees twisting upward into the black void of the sky. There were no stars, no moon, just an empty expanse of darkness that felt far too close. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, and without it, the shadows seemed to press in tighter, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice hoarse and weak. It wasn't a call, it was a plea, a desperate hope that he might still be out there somewhere. But the silence that followed was worse than any answer I could have imagined. It wasn't empty, it was expectant. I took a tentative step forward, the frost crunching beneath my boots. The air felt thicker with each movement, the mist swirling faster now, as though it was reacting to me. The hum grew louder, syncing with the rhythm of my heartbeat, and I had to fight the urge to cover my ears. It wasn't a sound you could block out. It was inside me. The first sign of movement came from the corner of my vision. A flicker of shadow, quick and fleeting, darting between the trees. I froze, my breath hitching, and turned my head slowly, straining to see through the fog. There was nothing there, just the endless stretch of forest, the gnarled branches reaching for the sky like claws. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I moved faster now, each step jarring and unsteady as I pushed forward, deeper into the woods. The shadows shifted around me, their movements deliberate and unnatural, and I could feel them watching, their hollow eyes burning into my back. The hum had turned into a low, guttural rumble, vibrating through the ground and up into my chest, making my teeth ache. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and breathy, barely more than the rustle of leaves in the wind. "This way." I stopped, my heart slamming against my ribs. The voice was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't Ryan. It couldn't be. But it was familiar, laced with something that tugged at the edges of my memory, something I couldn't quite place. The mist parted slightly, revealing a faint glow in the distance. It was weak, flickering, but it was enough to pull me forward. The whisper came again, louder this time, but no less haunting. "Keep going." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was endless, the shadows unrelenting, and the light was the only thing that felt real. I stumbled toward it, my steps uneven, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The glow grew brighter as I approached, taking on a strange, almost liquid quality, like it was seeping through the trees themselves. The source of the light was a clearing, its edges marked by the same twisted, skeletal trees that filled the rest of the forest. At its center was a pool of water, its surface perfectly still despite the faint ripples of light that danced across it. The glow came from beneath the surface, shifting and swirling like something alive. I stepped closer, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth at the edge of the pool. The air here was colder, sharper, and I could feel it cutting into my skin like needles. The water reflected nothing, not the trees, not the sky, not me. It was a void, an absence, and the light beneath it only made it feel deeper, more endless. "It's waiting," the whisper said, louder now, coming from all around me. It's always been waiting. The water began to move. Slowly at first, the surface rippling outward in perfect circles, but then faster, more violently, until the glow beneath it began to pulse. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through my chest, my skull, drowning out every thought except one. "Don't look." But I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the center of the pool, where the glow was brightest, its light piercing through the darkness like a blade. Something was rising, pushing its way through the surface with slow, deliberate movements. At first, it was just a shape, a formless shadow that twisted and stretched, its edges blurring like smoke. But as it emerged, it began to take form. A hand, pale and skeletal, broke through the water, its fingers impossibly long, the skin stretched too tightly over jagged bones. Then came the arm, thin and angular, followed by the sharp curve of a shoulder. And the face. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Its features were sharp, exaggerated, as though someone had taken the idea of a face and twisted it into something monstrous. Its eyes were empty sockets, but they glowed faintly, the same sickly light that pulsed beneath the water. Its mouth was wide, too wide, splitting its face in half with a grin that was all wrong. It didn't move. It just stared, its hollow gaze locked onto mine, and I felt something shift inside me. A pull, faint but unrelenting, like a thread being tugged at the very center of my being. "You brought it here," the whisper said, sharp and accusatory. "It's yours now." The thing tilted its head, its grin widening, and began to crawl out of the pool. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it was unused to the act of moving. The light beneath the water flared, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing, and the hum reached a crescendo, a sound so loud it felt like my skull was splitting. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, and turned to run. But the shadows were already there, closing in, their forms solidifying into shapes that shouldn't have existed. They reached for me, their long fingers curling around the air, and I knew there was no escaping them. And then everything went black. The darkness that swallowed me wasn't empty. It pulsed, alive and suffocating, a void that pressed against me from every direction. I couldn't tell if I was falling, floating, or simply suspended in nothingness, but the cold was relentless, piercing every inch of me like frozen needles. My thoughts came in fragments, slipping away as quickly as they formed, as though the darkness itself was devouring them. The hum returned, louder now, reverberating through the void and into my chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, pulling me deeper, stripping away every sense of where I was or how long I'd been here. Panic clawed at me, but even that felt distant, dulled by the weight of the void. And then, through the noise, came the whispers. "You belong here. You brought it. It has always been waiting." The voices overlapped, blending into a dissonant chorus that twisted and turned, refusing to let me make sense of their words. But the meaning seeped into me all the same, carried on the vibrations of the hum. This place wasn't just emptiness. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me. A flash of light broke through the darkness, sudden and blinding, and I gasped. My lungs burned as though I hadn't breathed in hours. The void fell away, replaced by a sharp biting cold that wrapped around me like a vice. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body, and for a moment, all I could do was lie there, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the forest, or something that looked like it. The trees loomed taller here, their branches knotted and gnarled, twisting together into unnatural shapes that blocked out the sky. The ground beneath me was soft and damp, the moss slick with frost that glinted faintly in the dim light. But the air was wrong. It was heavier, thicker, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The mist was still there, curling around the bases of the trees, but it was different now, denser, darker, as though it was alive. And then I saw it. At first it was just a flicker, a faint glow deep within the forest, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. But as I watched, it grew brighter, spreading outward and casting jagged shadows across the trees. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the light wasn't random. It was coming from something. I moved toward it, my steps hesitant and unsteady. The ground shifted beneath me, the moss giving way to bare earth that felt too soft, too pliable, like it was decaying underfoot. The cold bit into me with every step, the air growing thinner, sharper, until each breath felt like it was slicing through my lungs. The glow grew brighter as I approached, illuminating a clearing at the center of the forest. At its heart was a structure, twisted and angular, its surface glinting like polished obsidian. It rose from the ground in jagged spires, each one covered in the same strange symbols that had been carved into the trees and etched into the pool I'd seen before. The light pulsed from within it, casting shifting patterns across the clearing, and the hum was deafening now, vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against one of the spires. The surface was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt, sending a sharp jolt up my arm. I pulled back, my hand trembling, but the touch had left something behind. My skin tingled, the sensation spreading outward, and I watched in horror as faint, glowing lines appeared on my palm, twisting together into one of the same symbols etched into the spire. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the clearing with their dissonant tones. You brought it here. It's your burden. It's always been you. The light from the spire flared, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the shadows around me began to move. They slithered across the ground, their forms twisting and contorting, merging together into something massive. The whispers grew louder, their words blending into a single piercing tone that made my head throb. And then it emerged. The thing that rose from the shadows wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Its form was fluid, shifting and stretching, its edges blurring like smoke. But its face, if you could call it that, was sharp, angular, and hollow. Its eyes were twin voids, deep and endless, and its mouth was a jagged line that stretched too wide, filled with teeth that gleamed like shattered glass. It moved toward me, its body bending and twisting unnaturally, and I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the ground, my body frozen as its gaze locked onto mine. The hum grew louder, filling my head, my chest, until it was all I could hear. You brought me, it said, its voice layered and fractured, cutting through the hum like a blade. You called me here. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't, I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't call you. It tilted its head, its jagged grin widening. You didn't have to. The light from the spire flared again, brighter this time, and the ground beneath me trembled. Cracks spread outward from the base of the structure, glowing with the same sickly light, and I realized with a jolt of panic that the forest was changing. The trees twisted and stretched, their branches reaching for the sky like desperate hands, and the shadows grew darker, deeper, swallowing everything they touched. The thing took another step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their venomous tones, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it wanted me. I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and bending as I stumbled through the shadows. The ground shifted beneath me, the cracks spreading faster, and the light from the spire followed me, pulsing like a beacon. The whispers chased me, their words sharp and accusing, and I could feel the thing behind me, its hollow gaze burning into my back. The hum reached a crescendo, and the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, the air rushing past me, as the light consumed everything, and the last thing I heard was the thing's voice, its words echoing in my mind. You can't escape what you are. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me as the world spun, leaving me disoriented and gasping for air. I didn't see, couldn't focus. My body ached, every nerve raw from the fall, but there was something worse. The ground beneath me was alive, the earth pulsing and writhing like it was breathing. I pushed myself to my hands and knees, gasping, but the ground refused to stay still. It rippled beneath me, sending waves of unease through my chest, and I could hear it, something moving just beneath the surface. The air was thick with the hum, that constant, low vibration that had followed me since I'd stepped onto the bridge. Only now, it was louder, sharper, a frequency that gnawed at my mind, crawling under my skin. The forest was gone. Or maybe it had never existed. There was no more mist, no more trees. The world around me was black, formless, as if I was in the heart of a void. The only thing that anchored me was the constant pulse beneath my feet, the hum that had grown into a low roar. I looked up, my eyes still adjusting to the darkness, and I saw it. A shape, a flicker in the void that shouldn't have been there. But it was. A figure, dark and featureless, its outline blurred as though it existed only halfway between this world and something else. Its presence pressed down on me, suffocating, filling every corner of the empty space. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, and the only thing I could hear was the hum, now vibrating through my body, my bones. The thing's form wavered, like smoke, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and crushing. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them pierce through me. And then it spoke. "You should never have come back." The voice wasn't a voice. It was an echo, a whisper that came from everywhere, that twisted and layered over itself, creating 1,000 different tones at once. It crawled inside my head, louder with each word. My skin prickled, my heart racing as my vision blurred, and the darkness seemed to press closer, threatening to collapse in on me. "You brought it with you." I couldn't move. My muscles were frozen, locked in place by the weight of its words, but my mind screamed to run, to do anything to escape this suffocating presence. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The darkness was still there, closing in, and the hum was inside me now, vibrating my skull, my teeth, my very soul. You followed," it hissed. And this time, I felt its voice scrape against my very being, like nails on glass. The air shifted then. Something changed. The ground below me began to tremble, the pulse underfoot intensifying, until it felt like the earth itself was writhing, like it was alive and angry. My fingers dug into the ground, trying to steady myself, but the surface seemed to ripple beneath me, like liquid. And then the hum stopped. Everything stopped. I couldn't breathe. And then I heard something else. Not a voice, but a sound. A scraping, like metal against metal, a low screeching that made my bones ache. The figure moved then, shifting its form like liquid, folding and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. Its shape bent and stretched unnaturally, its edges distorting and reshaping with every movement. And then its form solidified. It was taller now, towering over me, its shape clearer, though still distorted. Its features began to emerge from the darkness, grotesque and unnatural. The outline of a face, smooth and pale as stone, stretched wide into a grin, too wide. A grin that split its face in half, jagged and uneven, its mouth dripping with something dark, something foul. "You brought it back." Its voice reverberated in my head again, stronger this time, filling every corner of my mind until I could feel it clawing at my sanity. The thing's grin stretched impossibly wide, the empty hollows of its eyes burning into me like flames, pulling me closer. The hum started again, but this time it was different. It was more. It was sharp. It was agonizing. "You can't escape it." The ground buckled beneath me, and I was falling again, falling deeper into the darkness, deeper into the thing's gaze. The world spun, a blur of cold and dark and pain, and I tried to scream, but my throat was raw, empty. My chest felt tight, as if the pressure of its voice was crushing me from the inside out. The figure above me loomed, its grin growing impossibly wide as I fell. But I didn't hit the ground. The hum surged again, violently, and I was stopped, frozen midair. My body was suspended, caught in the grip of whatever force was holding me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pressure built, and with it, the darkness around me began to shift. The void was no longer empty. It was full of things. Thousands of them, crawling out of the darkness, their forms impossible to comprehend, twisting and warping like they were made of shadows and smoke. I saw faces in the darkness, flickering in and out of existence. Faces I recognized. Faces I shouldn't have recognized. Ryan's face was there, twisted and stretched in ways I couldn't look at without feeling my stomach churn. He reached out, his eyes empty, his mouth open in a soundless scream. His form wavered, flickering like a broken film reel, and then he was gone, replaced by someone else, someone I had lost long ago. I tried to close my eyes, but it didn't help. They were still there. The faces, the figures, all of them whispering, speaking, calling. It's here. It's always been here. The voice wasn't Ryan's anymore. It was something worse, something more, something that shouldn't have existed, and yet it did. And then, as quickly as it had come, the darkness vanished. I was standing on the bridge again, the air still and cold, the mist wrapping around me like a blanket. But the bridge was different now. The wood was cracked and rotting, the metal railings twisted and bent. The sky above was dark, but not the comforting dark of night. It was a suffocating, choking dark that seemed to drown everything beneath it. The hum was gone, replaced by an unnatural silence that pressed in on me, crushing, suffocating. The figure was gone. Faces were gone, but the emptiness remained, lingering like a shadow in the pit of my stomach. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I hadn't escaped. Not really. It was still here. It was always here. And it was waiting. O'Neill. Yan. The ground beneath me buckled, and I could feel the cold air pressing in, as if the very atmosphere was trying to crush me. The bridge stretched endlessly, now even more dilapidated, the wood beneath my feet trembling with a strange, unnatural force. Every step was a battle against the pressure weighing on my chest, the darkness that clung to the edges of my vision, threatening to consume me whole. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The faces, Ryan's face, still haunted me, flickering in my mind like fractured memories. I knew the hum wasn't gone. It was inside me now, deep in my bones, vibrating my very soul. The bridge, the trees, the endless mist, it was all wrong. It was like a nightmare that wouldn't end, like I was trapped in some twisted reflection of reality, bound by invisible threads I couldn't see, yet I felt them pulling me further into this abyss. I took a step forward, my breath shaky, and my heart thundering in my chest. The world had grown quieter, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a suffocating silence that gripped my mind, making every second feel like an eternity. I'd hear my footsteps, loud and distorted, against the backdrop of the stillness. The shadows, too, had shifted. They were longer now, darker, almost sentient, creeping along the broken planks of the bridge, curling around me, as though they were reaching, waiting. I couldn't help but look behind me, half expecting something to follow. Something was following. The faintest sound, shuffling, scraping, came from the direction I had just crossed. But when I turned, there was nothing. The fog had thickened, swallowed every trace of what was behind me, but the feeling remained. It was getting closer. And then I saw it. A figure. Not Ryan, but something worse. It was tall, hunched, and the light flickered across its form in jagged pulses. I didn't make out its face, or maybe it was because it didn't have one. It was just a shape, like a shadow made flesh, its outline shifting and folding like something living. The more I focused on it, the more I realized that it wasn't just standing there. It was growing. I froze, the air grown colder, thicker. The darkness around it stretched, swallowing the edges of the bridge. The hum came again, louder, sharper, vibrating through my teeth, rattling my skull. The figure turned toward me, and I could feel its eyes on me. Not eyes, but something worse. A presence that filled every corner of the bridge, a weight that made my chest constrict. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "You're too late," the voice said, though the words weren't spoken aloud. They thrummed in my mind, deeper than any voice I'd ever heard. "It's already begun. You brought it here." The thing took a step forward, and with it, the ground beneath me trembled. I could feel the vibrations in my feet, in my teeth, in my bones. The air was charged, crackling like static as the shadows surged forward, crawling up the bridge's broken frame. I couldn't breathe. The bridge was falling apart, its planks cracking, splintering beneath my feet, but my legs refused to move. I felt them locked in place, bound by the same invisible force that had been haunting me since I stepped onto this cursed bridge. Another step, and the thing was closer. Its form was shifting, no longer a simple silhouette, but something far darker, far more twisted. It was made of the same suffocating void that surrounded the bridge, a reflection of everything that had been wrong about this place from the very beginning. It doesn't matter if you run. It doesn't matter if you beg. You're already here. The hum grew louder. It filled my mind, buzzing in my ears, until it felt like the very air was alive with it. I felt something shifting, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. The ground beneath me cracked further, the shadows closing in on all sides, until I was standing at the edge of the bridge. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The figure loomed, its presence pressing in from all directions, suffocating me. And the shadows? They were no longer just around me. They were me. I could feel them crawling up my arms, across my skin, digging into my chest, suffocating my breath, pulling me into the depths of the bridge. The figure spoke again, but this time the words weren't in my mind. They were coming from everywhere. They wrapped around me, coiled themselves tight until I couldn't escape them. "You have come to feed it." I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. The shadows were everywhere now, twisting around my legs, crawling up my body, and I could feel them pulling at me, tearing at me, like they were trying to rip me apart from the inside. The bridge was collapsing. I could feel it. The entire structure was failing. The wood was splintering beneath my feet, the metal rails warping and twisting, and the world around me began to blur. The hum was deafening now, an unbearable noise that filled every part of me, and I felt my body shaking, my limbs jerking uncontrollably. It was as if I was being torn between two worlds, the one I knew and the one that had been waiting for me. And then the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I heard was the figure's voice, distant and hollow. "You are mine now." And everything went dark. I don't know how long I was falling, but when I hit the ground it wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced. The force of the impact was sharp, like 1,000 needles piercing my skin, but it didn't hurt in the way I expected. It felt wrong. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It was soft, like a sponge, and it squelched beneath me, as though the earth itself had turned to liquid. I gasped for air, but it felt as though my lungs were filled with something thick, something that didn't belong. The air was heavy and suffocating, and the world around me was still dark. I couldn't see anything. There was no light, no indication of where I was or how I got here. Just a thick, unrelenting blackness that stretched on forever. The hum was gone now. The absence of it left a kind of void in my head, a hollow echo that rang louder than any noise could. My mind swirled with fragments, images of the bridge, of Ryan, of the thing that had followed me. And then I felt it, creeping into the edges of my thoughts, creeping into me. "You didn't escape." The words weren't spoken aloud. They didn't need to be. They filled my head, their meaning pressing against me with an unbearable weight. It was the same voice, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere. Inside my skull, in the pit of my stomach, in the space between my ribs. It was suffocating me from the inside out. I tried to move, but my body was heavy. Every limb felt like it was made of lead, as if the weight of everything, the shadows, the thing, the void, was pressing me down into the ground. I tried to call out, but my throat was dry, constricted, and the air was thick, too thick, to even make a sound. The darkness, it was alive. And then I realized. The ground wasn't soft because it was made of earth. It was soft because it was made of flesh. The texture was wrong, fleshy, and pulsing with something more than just biological rhythm. I could feel it now, each thrum reverberating through my body, from my bones to my fingertips. I tried to pull away, but my hands sank deeper into the surface, as though the ground was pulling me in. My legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't fight. And then I saw it. A flicker of light, just a flicker, far in the distance, so faint I could barely make it out. It pulsed, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that didn't belong in the black void. I didn't know if it was real, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching for it, crawling forward on my stomach, dragging my unwilling body through the thick, soupy ground. The light grew brighter, closer, and with it, the sound of movement. The same hum, but sharper now, more painful. It wasn't just an auditory sensation. It was inside me, wrapping around my insides, eating away at my sanity. I pressed forward, my arms shaking with the effort, my mind clouded with panic and dread, but there was no turning back. I couldn't even remember what I was running from. I could feel it, though, right behind me. The thing that had been stalking me from the moment I set foot on the bridge, it was still there. The hunger, the emptiness. It hadn't let me go. The light ahead grew brighter, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that it wasn't just a light, it was a door. It wasn't like any door I had ever seen, not a physical thing, but something else. A rift, a tear in the very fabric of this place, glowing with the same sickly green that had suffused everything from the moment I stepped into this nightmare. And then I heard it. The voice. It was the same voice, but it was different now. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking for me. My own voice, layered on top of the other. The same words spilling out of my mouth, but not in my control. You are already here. My heart stopped. The voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was twisted, distorted, as though the place itself had taken my essence and turned it against me. I could hear myself speaking, but it wasn't me. It was something else. A version of me that had long since drowned in the depths of this place. I was crawling, dragging myself towards that light, but I was already there. I had been there from the start. The bridge had been the beginning, the place where everything shifted, where time twisted, and reality bent itself into something unrecognizable. The light wasn't an escape. It was the end. The thing behind me was closer now. I didn't have to look. I could feel its presence, its hunger, its endless desire to consume me whole. I knew it. It was waiting for me. It was waiting for this moment, the moment when I would realize that there was no escape, that the door was just another prison. Another trap. Kai. I reached for it anyway. I had no choice. The moment my hand touched the light, the world collapsed around me. The force of it was like being pulled apart, every part of me unraveling, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a scream. No, not even that. I was gone, lost to whatever this place had become. The ground beneath me split open, and the void swallowed me whole, leaving only the echoes of my existence behind. And then, silence. The kind of silence that was all-consuming, that lasted forever. The letter arrived on my doorstep in the dead of night, though I never saw who left it. A plain white envelope, resting perfectly centered on the old welcome mat like it belonged there, like it had always been there. I picked it up slowly, the paper damp with cold, and turned it over. No stamp. No return address. Just my name written in sharp, spidery handwriting that dug into the surface of the envelope like it had been scratched there by something desperate. For a long moment, I stood motionless in the silence of my apartment, staring at the thing. It felt wrong, so wrong I nearly dropped it, like the paper itself had a pulse I could feel beneath my fingers. But I didn't drop it. I opened it. Inside was a single card. You have been chosen. The Red Veil Challenge awaits you. Meet us at 13 Widows Hollow Road, Salem. Midnight. No phones. No questions. Just come. Mali. Name. The room seemed colder suddenly, the shadows stretching across the walls as though they were alive. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I should have ignored it. I should have thrown it in the trash and forgotten it ever existed. But I didn't. I packed a bag, locked the door, and drove straight into the dark. The road to Salem felt different that night, emptier somehow, though I couldn't say why. The streetlights flickered as I passed, casting harsh white halos onto the cracked pavement. Miles of dark forest pressed in on either side of me, their gnarled limbs clawing at the sky like they were reaching for something they could never catch. Widow's Hollow Road wasn't marked on my GPS. I only knew I'd found it because a rusted iron sign stood half buried in the dirt at the mouth of a narrow lane, the words etched deep like scars. I turned down the road, tires crunching over loose gravel, and the woods grew thicker. The trees leaned closer now, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like fingernails. Ahead, I saw it, the house. It loomed at the end of the road like a forgotten memory, tall and black, its spires clawing at the moonless sky. The windows were dark, empty hollows that watched me as I killed the engine. My hands lingered on the wheel for a moment longer than they should have, my chest tightening. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to turn the car around and never look back. But something was pulling me toward it. The front door was already ajar when I reached the porch, as if the house had been waiting for me. The wood groaned beneath my feet as I stepped inside, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a warning. My breath misted in the cold air, though I couldn't feel a draft. The room beyond the entryway was vast, larger than it should have been, like the house had stretched itself to accommodate something monstrous. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling through the narrow beams of light that filtered through the filthy windows. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, its pattern faded and stained, and a long wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. And they were there. The others. 5 people sat scattered around the table, their faces pale and drawn, their clothes rumpled like they'd been wearing them for days. None of them looked at me as I entered, but I knew they felt me. I could see it in the way their shoulders tensed, their hands curling against the arms of their chairs. In front of each of them was a small red envelope, identical to the one that had brought me here. And as I looked closer, I realized there was one more chair at the table, one more envelope. Mine. I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to touch it. But my feet carried me forward, and before I knew it, I was lowering myself into the chair. The wood was ice cold against my skin, biting through the fabric of my jeans. My hands shook as I picked up the envelope, my fingers brushing against the surface. It felt warm, too warm, like it had been sitting in someone's pocket just moments before. I tore it open. Inside was a small card, its edges worn and frayed. There was no text, only a symbol, something like a circle, split down the center by a jagged line. I turned the card over, searching for anything else, but there was nothing. And then the door slammed shut. The sound exploded through the house like a gunshot, rattling the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I jolted upright, my chair screeching against the wood as the lights above us flared to life, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. That's when I saw them. The shadows. They weren't ours. They stretched out from the chairs, from our feet, but they didn't move the way shadows should. They writhed and twisted against the floor, reaching toward each other like they were trying to connect, to fuse into something larger. The others noticed it too. One of them, a woman with wild dark hair, screamed and bolted for the door. She didn't make it. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air seemed to bend. I watched, frozen, as her body went rigid, her limbs locking into place like a mannequin's. Her head snapped backward, and she let out a low, hollow gasp before she crumpled to the floor. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the shadows shifted again. This time, they crawled upward. The table rattled violently as something moved beneath it, something heavy and alive. A low hum began to fill the room, vibrating through my chest like the walls were breathing. I looked at the others, but no one spoke. Their eyes were fixed on the center of the table, where a single crack had appeared in the wood. Slowly, impossibly, the crack widened, splintering outward like veins. The hum grew louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. And then something rose from the table, something thin and black and wet, its edges curling as it took shape. A hand. No one screamed this time. No one moved. We just watched as the hand gripped the edge of the table, pulling itself upward, followed by an arm, a shoulder, a head. The lights went out. For a single, infinite moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. And then a voice, soft, calm, and so close it felt like it was whispering directly into my ear. Welcome to the game. The lights flared back on, with a crackling hiss, and I was staring at the table again, empty now, save for the splintered wood where that thing had emerged. The others sat frozen in their chairs, their faces pale and bloodless, eyes darting to the door where the woman had fallen. But she was gone. The spot where her body had crumpled was empty, the wood beneath it untouched. It was like she'd never been there at all. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw, as I pushed myself shakily to my feet. The silence stretched longer than it should have, broken only by the faint hum, still vibrating through the air like a distant echo. I looked at the others, 5 strangers, each one of them too afraid to speak. We were caught in the same thought. What do we do now? I didn't want to be the one to break the silence, but my voice scraped out anyway. We need to leave. No one moved. They were looking at something behind me. I turned, slow and heavy, like my body wasn't mine anymore. The door was open, not the front door, but another one, hidden in the far corner of the room. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it, but now it yawned wide, spilling a dull red light onto the rotted floorboards, like the glow of dying embers. A cold breeze drifted from the doorway, carrying with it the scent of something damp and metallic. I could taste it on my tongue, sharp and sour, as it settled in the back of my throat. My legs felt locked in place, but something in me whispered, "Go." One by one, the others stood. No words passed between us. There was no discussion, no argument. We all moved toward the doorway as though some invisible hand had reached inside us and pulled. The red light grew brighter as we stepped across the threshold, one after the other, into a narrow hallway that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. The walls here were different. They were smooth and black, slick like they were coated in oil, and they pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat. I kept my head down, refusing to look too closely, because I knew if I did, I'd see something moving beneath the surface. The hallway narrowed the farther we went, the air growing thicker with every step. I could hear footsteps behind me, too many of them, more than there should have been, but I didn't dare turn around. My chest grew tight, my breathing shallow. It felt like the walls were closing in, squeezing me from both sides. And then the sound started, a faint dripping, slow and rhythmic, echoing off the walls. I stopped walking, my shoes scuffing against the slick floor. The others halted, glancing nervously at one another, but no one spoke. I craned my head forward, listening, and realized the sound wasn't coming from far away. It was coming from above. I tilted my head back. The ceiling was low here, barely an arm's length above us, and it was wet, slick with something dark that ran in rivulets down the walls. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it. A shape, thin and crooked, was crawling across the ceiling, its limbs splayed out at impossible angles. It moved slowly, deliberately, its hands and feet smearing trails of black liquid across the surface. And then it stopped. I couldn't see its face, not at first, but I felt it looking at me. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, my body locking in place as the figure turned its head, slowly, until it was upside down. A face stared back at me through the darkness, white and featureless, except for a mouth. A mouth too wide, with jagged teeth that seemed to grin as it dropped silently to the floor. We ran. I don't know who started it, maybe all of us at once, but I bolted forward, my feet pounding against the floor as the others stumbled and gasped behind me. The hallway seemed endless, stretching farther no matter how fast we moved, the red light pulsing brighter with every step. The thing followed. I didn't need to look to know it was there. I could hear it. The wet slap of its hands and feet against the floor, the low, rattling hiss that grew louder as it closed the distance. I sprinted faster, my vision tunneling, my lungs burning with every gasping breath. And then, just when I thought the hallway would swallow me whole, I saw it, a door. This one was different, an old wooden door, cracked and splintered, with no light spilling from its edges. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, practically throwing myself inside. The others followed, stumbling, gasping, slamming the door shut behind us. The sound stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I collapsed against the door, my legs trembling, my forehead pressed against the cold wood as I tried to calm my breathing. The others were sprawled across the room, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with unspoken terror. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The room we'd entered was massive, a sprawling space that stretched far beyond what the house should have allowed. The walls were lined with empty shelves, rows upon rows of them, as though the room had once held a vast collection of something long since removed. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling, its glow flickering weakly, barely pushing back the dark. At the far end of the room stood a large mirror, tall and cracked, its surface warped and stained like it hadn't been touched in decades. I stepped closer. The others stayed back, whispering in low, frantic tones, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, pale and haggard, but something was wrong. The cracks spread across the glass, splitting my face into pieces, and as I leaned closer, the reflection began to move. It blinked. I didn't. I stumbled backward, my breath catching, as the figure in the mirror smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was too wide, too wrong, stretching across its face like a wound. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed its palm against the glass. The cracks spread outward, splintering faster, until the entire mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crash. And the thing stepped through. The thing crawled out of the shattered mirror, and I swear it pulled something with it. The air changed, thicker, colder, like the room itself was holding its breath. I stumbled back, my shoes skidding against broken shards of glass that crunched underfoot. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure standing in the mess of the mirror wore my face like a mask. It moved slowly, with a deliberate stiffness, its head tilted just slightly, the same way the others had done before. Its smile was carved into its face, too wide, teeth too sharp, and its empty eyes followed me as though it knew every thought screaming in my head. I backed away, bumping into one of the empty shelves, knocking a cloud of dust into the stale air. My voice was barely a whisper. "What are you?" It took a step forward. Its bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor, even as shards of glass glittered and splintered beneath it. My chest heaved. I could feel the others behind me, 5 strangers I'd only known for moments that felt like lifetimes, but none of us moved. Then it spoke. It used my voice. "You brought me here." Cold shivers slithered down my spine, and I shook my head instinctively, my throat dry. No, I didn't. The thing smiled wider, the corners of its mouth stretching until they looked like they might tear. "You called me," it whispered. I answered. The light bulb above us flickered violently, and the shadows along the walls shifted, elongating, twisting like they were trying to break free. One of the others finally moved. A man, tall, with graying hair and wide, terrified eyes, bolted for the door we'd come through, his hands fumbling for the handle. It didn't open. The thing didn't even look at him. Its hollow gaze was locked on me, as though we were the only 2 people in the room. I took another step back, my pulse pounding so loudly I thought it might split my skull. "Why are you doing this?" I croaked. The figure's head jerked to the side, an unnatural snap like a doll's neck turning too far. "You need to remember." "Remember what?" It raised its hand slowly, and I saw something dripping from its fingertips, thick and black, like oil. It stretched its arm out toward me, the glass beneath its feet melting into the same dark liquid. My chest tightened, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move. And then it lunged. I dove to the side, narrowly missing the outstretched hand as it swiped through the air where I'd been standing. The others screamed, one of them stumbling over a fallen shelf, as the thing twisted toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, limbs snapping into place as though its bones were being rearranged. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly toward the far end of the room. The shelves blurred past me, their rows warping into something wrong, endless, looping back on themselves like I'd fallen into a labyrinth. I heard the others behind me, their footsteps chaotic, their panicked breaths filling the suffocating air. The thing was chasing me. I could hear it, no footsteps, just the faint wet sound of something sliding across the floor, dragging itself closer. The light flickered wildly now, stuttering between brightness and shadow, and in every burst of darkness I saw it, closer, smiling. I turned a corner, and suddenly, the shelves ended. I was standing in front of another door, this one carved from heavy, blackened wood. The others appeared behind me, panting, wide-eyed, their faces slick with sweat. None of us said anything. There was no time. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open. We stumbled through into the night air. I fell to my knees, gasping, as the cold hit me like a slap to the face. The door slammed shut behind us, and I twisted to look back. The house was gone. We were standing in a field now, endless, flat, stretching toward the horizon beneath a sky that didn't look like a sky at all. It was black, like ink, and studded with pale white lights that swirled slowly, like they were being stirred by an unseen hand. The ground beneath me was soft, too soft, and when I touched it, it felt wet. My hand came away, stained with something dark. "Where are we?" someone whispered behind me. I didn't turn to see who. There was no answer. There were no landmarks, no trees, no buildings, just that strange, unnatural void above us and the endless expanse of empty ground. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me, and turned in a slow circle. That's when I saw the shapes. They were far off at first, silhouettes against the horizon, tall, thin, and motionless. But they were coming closer. I couldn't see them move, but every time I blinked, they were nearer. My breath caught, and I staggered back, bumping into the others. "Run," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Run." We bolted as one, sprinting blindly across the field. My lungs burned, my vision swimming, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't dare look back. I knew they were still there. I could feel them behind me, their gaze heavy and cold, their presence spreading like frostbite across my skin. The ground shifted beneath my feet, growing softer with every step, until it felt like I was running across sand. The others were slowing too, their steps uneven, their breaths ragged and desperate. And then, up ahead, I saw it, a single, crumbling structure rising out of the earth. A church. It looked ancient, its stone walls weathered and cracked, its steeple crooked against the swirling sky. The doors were wide open, beckoning like a mouth about to swallow us whole. I didn't care. I ran for it, every instinct screaming that it was the only chance we had. We stumbled inside, collapsing against the cold stone floor as the doors groaned shut behind us. The air was damp and still, heavy with the scent of mold and something faintly metallic. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my chest heaving as I looked around. The interior of the church was in ruins. Pews lay shattered across the floor, their wood splintered and rotting. A single stained glass window stood at the far end, its colors muted and cracked, casting a dull, fractured glow across the altar below it. And on the altar sat a book. It was massive, its cover blackened and worn, its edges frayed like it had been chewed by rats. It shouldn't have stood out among the decay, but it did. My eyes were drawn to it, pulled toward it as though it held the answers to every question I'd been too afraid to ask. The others were silent now. I could feel them staring at the book too, their bodies tense and unmoving. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the doors behind us creaked. Something was coming. The doors creaked louder this time, slow and deliberate, as though the thing on the other side wanted us to hear it coming. I turned my head toward the sound, my pulse hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. The others were frozen, their eyes fixed on the entrance as the heavy wooden doors inched open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And then it stepped inside. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but the shape of it was all wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its head bent awkwardly to one side, brushing the top of the frame as it crossed the threshold, limbs swaying unnaturally with every step. The air shifted when it moved, colder somehow, pressing against my skin like frost. I staggered back instinctively, my eyes darting toward the book on the altar. It sat there, still and waiting, as though it knew we would come to it. The others must have felt it too. None of us said a word, but we moved as one, edging closer to the altar while the thing loomed behind us, silent and watching. The first to touch the book was the man who'd run for the door earlier. His hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing the rough, blackened cover. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the church began to breathe. The walls groaned, their stones grinding together like bones snapping. The stained glass window shuddered in its frame, the light filtering through it, twisting and warping into something unrecognizable. Dust rained from the ceiling in thin, slow cascades, swirling around us like snow. And then the book opened. Pages flipped on their own, too quickly for me to make out the writing. Though I caught glimpses of strange symbols, jagged lines and circles that looked more like wounds than words. The man's mouth moved silently as he stared at the book, his eyes wide and glassy. I wanted to pull him away, to scream at him to stop, but I couldn't move. And then he spoke. The words that spilled from his mouth were a language I'd never heard, harsh and guttural, scraping against my ears like metal on stone. The sound filled the church, bouncing off the walls, vibrating in my chest. My vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping into the corners like ink spreading through water. "Stop!" I choked, forcing the word from my throat, but he didn't hear me. He didn't see me anymore. The figure by the door took another step forward. I felt it move, even though I couldn't bear to look at it. The man at the altar kept chanting, his voice growing louder and more distorted, like it was being pulled through a broken speaker. And then, He stopped. His body went rigid. The book slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the ruined church. For a moment, no one moved. The air hung still and heavy, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Then the man turned around. His eyes were gone, black pits that seemed to swallow the light, his face slack and empty. But he smiled, that same wide, jagged smile I'd seen before. "It's awake," he whispered. The church exploded into motion. The doors slammed shut behind the figure, trapping us inside. The stained glass window shattered, shards raining down in a cascade of muted color. The walls shook violently, cracks splintering outward like veins, and the pews splintered into piles of rotted wood as though the earth itself had opened beneath them. I grabbed the nearest person, a woman with blonde hair and wide, terrified eyes, and pulled her toward the far corner of the room. The others scrambled after us, scattering like insects as the man who'd opened the book began to convulse. His limbs jerked violently, his head snapping backward, as though something inside him was trying to claw its way out. The ground split open at his feet, a jagged fissure yawning wide, spilling an unnatural red light into the room. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, and from deep within it I heard a sound, low and rhythmic, like something massive breathing far below. "We have to go," someone screamed, their voice breaking through the chaos. I didn't look back. I grabbed the woman's arm and ran, my feet sliding on the cracked stone as the ground heaved beneath us. There was another door on the far side of the church, smaller, half hidden in shadow. But it was a door, and it was open. The others followed, their footsteps echoing wildly as we raced toward it. Behind us, the man screamed. It wasn't human. I risked one glance over my shoulder as I reached the door. The man's body was wrong. His arms stretched unnaturally, his back arching as the fissure beneath him widened, swallowing the altar whole. Black liquid seeped up from the crack, spreading across the floor like veins, and the figure that had followed us into the church stood motionless, watching. We tumbled through the door, collapsing onto rough dirt and grass. I gasped, my lungs burning as I scrambled to my feet, spinning around to see the door slam shut behind us. The church was gone. In its place stood a forest. The trees were tall and skeletal, their branches twisting together high above us to block out the sky. The only light came from the same red glow we'd seen before, filtering faintly through the gaps in the trees, like blood leaking through cracks in a wall. I could hear the others panting around me, their bodies shaking as they tried to catch their breath. "What the hell is happening?" someone whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the path ahead of us, a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest, the light growing dimmer the farther it went. I could feel something waiting for us in there, watching from the shadows, though I couldn't see it. The woman I'd pulled from the church turned to me, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "Do you hear that?" I didn't want to, but I did. A low hum, soft at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the forest, rising and falling like the sound of something breathing. My body felt heavy, like the air had thickened around me, holding me in place. And then the trees began to move. Their branches creaked and groaned, twisting and bending, as though something massive was pushing through them, unseen. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through my chest, until it was all I could hear. I turned to run, but the others were already moving, stumbling blindly down the path, deeper into the dark. I followed. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I ran, the sound of the hum surrounding us, echoing through the trees. The path twisted and turned, leading us farther from where we'd started, until the red light faded entirely, leaving only shadows. And then I saw it. A shape, standing in the middle of the path, tall and thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Because behind me, I could hear them coming. I don't know why I stopped running. Maybe it was instinct, some primal part of me that knew if I kept moving, I would only run straight into it. The figure stood perfectly still in the middle of the path, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the twisted trees surrounding it. It was tall and thin, its arms dangling limply at its sides, its head tilted too far, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Behind me, the others stumbled to a halt one by one, their ragged breaths punctuating the tense silence. I didn't dare turn to look at them. I could feel the panic radiating off them like heat, hear the shuffling of feet as someone shifted nervously. The hum hadn't stopped. It pressed against my eardrums, vibrating through my chest like the thrum of some enormous machine deep underground. The figure on the path didn't move, but I could feel it watching us, waiting. I took a step back, my foot snapping a dry twig beneath me. The sound was deafening. The figure twitched. Not a step. Not a movement. Just a sudden jerking shift, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Its head snapped toward me, and I felt my stomach drop. There were no features, no eyes, just a smooth, pale surface where a face should have been. I couldn't breathe. A hand grabbed my arm. I flinched, my head snapping to the side. It was a woman with the blonde hair, her face pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. She shook her head desperately, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," she mouthed. I nodded, my heart pounding, and took another step back. The others followed suit, moving as slowly and quietly as possible. My eyes never left the figure in the path. It still hadn't moved again, but it felt closer somehow, like the distance between us was shrinking even though none of us had crossed it. I blinked. It was closer. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of the hum. The figure stood only a few feet away now, its head still tilted, its arms longer than they should have been. "Run," I whispered. The word was barely out of my mouth before the woman's hand slipped from my arm, and we turned and bolted. The path blurred around me as I ran, the branches whipping at my face and arms, tearing at my clothes like they didn't want to let me go. Behind me, I heard someone scream, a raw, ragged sound that was cut off far too quickly. I didn't look back. The trees seemed to close in, the darkness pressing tighter around us with every step. The path twisted and turned, disorienting and endless, but I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for me to stop. And then, out of nowhere, I saw the clearing. A break in the trees, up ahead, a patch of open ground lit by the faint, sickly glow of the swirling sky. I sprinted toward it, my body moving on pure adrenaline now, every muscle aching as I forced myself forward. I stumbled into the clearing, collapsing to my knees in the grass. The others followed, 3 of them, gasping and trembling as they emerged from the darkness. The blonde woman was there. A man in a tattered jacket staggered beside her, blood smeared across his face. Third was the tall, gray-haired man. The rest were gone. The clearing was small and circular, surrounded by trees that seemed taller and blacker here, their branches arching overhead like the bars of a cage. At the center of the clearing stood an old well, its stones cracked and weathered, the wood of the winch splintered and rotting. A faint red light spilled out from somewhere deep within it, pulsing in time with the hum that still filled the air. I didn't want to go near it. None of us did. But as we stared at the well, the hum grew louder, the vibration shaking through the ground beneath us until it felt like the earth itself was alive. "It's coming from there," the gray-haired man said, his voice shaking. I opened my mouth to tell him to stop, to shut up, but the blonde woman was already moving. She stepped toward the well, her movements slow and deliberate, like she wasn't in control of herself anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the red glow, her face blank. "Wait!" I croaked, forcing myself to stand. My legs trembled beneath me. "Don't go near it." She didn't listen. The others didn't move. They just watched, wide-eyed and silent, as she reached the edge of the well and peered down into the darkness. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then she spoke, her voice hollow and flat. "It's not deep," she said. The hum spiked suddenly, sharp and deafening, rattling through my skull. I stumbled forward, clamping my hands over my ears as the sound grew unbearable. The others cried out, their voices lost in the overwhelming noise. And then it stopped. I lifted my head slowly, blinking against the sudden silence. The woman was gone. I stared at the well, my body frozen, my breath shallow. The red glow had dimmed now, pulsing faintly beneath the surface, but the hum had changed. It was quieter now, softer, like something was breathing. "Where is she?" the man in the jacket whispered, his voice trembling. The gray-haired man stepped toward the well, his face pale and drawn. "She's still down there." I shook my head. "Don't." But he was already leaning over the edge. I watched as his expression shifted, confusion flashing across his face before it twisted into something else. "Something wrong." He smiled. And then he jumped. I choked out a scream, stumbling back as the man's body disappeared into the well. The hum roared back to life, louder than before, vibrating through the ground so hard I thought the earth might split open beneath me. The man in the jacket grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here." I didn't argue. We turned and ran for the tree line, sprinting blindly back into the darkness of the forest. The hum followed us, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And somewhere behind us, just beneath the sound, I heard something else. Laughter. Not loud, not manic. Just soft and distant, echoing faintly through the trees, like it had been waiting for us the whole time. The laughter followed us. Soft and distant at first, but it grew louder as we stumbled deeper into the forest. Thin, high-pitched chuckles that danced through the trees like whispers carried on the wind. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of our frantic steps, crunching over the roots and underbrush. The man in the jacket was ahead of me now, his silhouette weaving through the darkness as he gasped for air. I could barely see him through the fog that had begun to creep along the forest floor, swirling around my ankles like tendrils trying to pull me down. My chest burned, each breath sharp and raw, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. "Keep going!" he shouted, his voice cracking. I wanted to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Something wasn't right with the forest. The trees seemed to close in tighter with every step, their gnarled branches twisting toward me, reaching. I glanced up once and saw the sky, or what was left of it. The swirling black void stretched far above, speckled with faint pinpricks of white light that flickered like dying stars. The laughter stopped. We froze, both of us panting, as the silence rushed back in. I strained to hear anything at all, but the forest had gone still, as though it was holding its breath. My skin prickled with the awful sense that we were being watched, and then I saw it. A light, soft, golden, glowing faintly through the fog, just up ahead. It looked impossible, out of place in this nightmare, like the warm glow of a candle glimpsed through the window of a house. The man in the jacket turned to me, his eyes wide and desperate. "There, that has to be a way out." I opened my mouth to argue, to say it felt like a trap, but he was already moving, stumbling through the fog toward the light. My legs felt heavy, as though the earth beneath me didn't want me to leave, but I forced myself to follow. The light grew brighter as we approached, spilling through the trees in warm, shifting patterns. I could see the source now, a small clearing, filled with dozens of lanterns hanging from the branches like strange fruit. They swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel, their glow casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. And at the center of the clearing stood a carnival tent. It was massive, its red and white fabric faded and stained, the stripes running like smeared paint. The entrance flapped open invitingly, but there was no sound, no music, just the faint rustle of canvas and the soft hum that had never fully left the air. The man in the jacket didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the entrance, ducking under the fabric and disappearing inside. I stopped just outside, my body trembling as I stared at the dark mouth of the tent. I didn't want to go in, but the silence behind me felt heavier than the unknown ahead. "Don't get left behind," I muttered to myself, and followed him inside. The air changed the moment I stepped through the entrance. It was colder here, sharp and metallic, and the ground beneath my feet was soft and uneven. The lantern light from outside barely pierced the darkness, leaving only thin beams of gold that wavered like ghostly fingers. "Hey!" I called out. It felt wrong to be loud here. "Where are you?" There was no response. I took another step forward, and the floor shifted beneath me. I froze, my stomach turning as I glanced down. The ground wasn't dirt. It was fabric, stretched tight and covered in stains that pulsed faintly beneath my weight, as though the tent itself were breathing. "Keep moving," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. Rows of booths appeared on either side of me, barely visible in the flickering light. They were warped and broken, their signs faded and splintered, but I could still read the words. "Fortunes told. Win a prize. Step right up." My footsteps echoed in the silence, louder than they should have been. And then I heard it. A soft melody, slow and hollow, like it was coming from a music box. The notes drifted through the air, repeating over and over, growing louder the farther I walked. My chest tightened as I rounded a corner and saw the source. A carousel. It stood in the center of the tent, its paint chipped and faded, its wooden horses twisted into grotesque shapes. Some were missing limbs. Others had mouths that stretched too wide, their teeth carved into sharp points. The carousel spun slowly, the music stuttering and skipping like a record caught on a loop. The man in the jacket was there, standing perfectly still beside the carousel, his head tilted as he stared at one of the horses. I approached slowly, every step a struggle against the weight in my legs. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. He just reached out and touched one of the horses. The moment his fingers made contact, the music stopped. The carousel shuddered to a halt, and the tent went dark. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just a black. And then the whispering started. It came from everywhere at once, soft, insidious murmurs that burrowed into my ears, my head, my bones. I clamped my hands over my ears, stumbling back, but the whispers only grew louder. I couldn't understand the words, but they wanted me to understand. The lanterns flared to life all at once, their golden light flickering wildly as the whispers stopped. I opened my eyes and froze. The man in the jacket was gone. The carousel was spinning again, faster now, the horses blurring into a whirl of jagged teeth and twisted limbs. The whispers returned, louder this time, repeating one word over and over in a voice that sounded almost like my own. "Stay." I turned and ran. The booths blurred past me as I sprinted toward the entrance, the lanterns above me bursting like fireworks, showering sparks that hissed against the fabric of the tent. The whispers followed, overlapping each other into a chorus that shook the ground beneath my feet. "Stay, stay, stay." I burst through the tent flap, collapsing onto the cold grass outside. The forest was gone. I was standing in the clearing again, but it was different now. The sky was darker, the fog thicker, and the well at the center pulsed with that same red light, brighter than before. I looked back at the tent. The entrance was gone. Only the lanterns remained, swaying gently in the silent air, their glow fading one by one until the clearing was plunged into darkness. And then, from somewhere far beneath me, I heard it. The breath rumbled through the ground, deep and slow, like something enormous exhaling beneath me. I froze where I stood, my legs trembling, my ears straining to hear where it was coming from. clearing had gone silent. So silent I could hear my heartbeat pounding like a drum inside my chest. I turned back toward the well. The red glow spilling from its depths had grown brighter, pulsing in slow, deliberate beats. It looked alive, the light shifting and swirling as though something was moving far below. I could feel the hum again, low, vibrating through my feet, into my chest, rattling my teeth like a distant engine roaring to life. Don't go near it. The thought burned in my mind, sharp and clear, but it didn't matter. My feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the well, even as the rest of me screamed to stop. The air grew colder with every step, sharp and metallic, heavy with that strange, coppery taste I couldn't shake. The whispers returned, soft at first, almost gentle, slithering through the clearing like smoke. Come closer. I reached the edge of the well and stared down into its depths. The light was blinding now, swirling like liquid fire, and in its center I saw something moving. A shadow. No, a shape. Long limbs, coiled and shifting, rising slowly toward me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The whispers grew louder. It's time. The shape emerged from the light. A hand, thin and twisted, its skin blackened and cracked like old stone, reached up toward me. Its fingers stretched long and sharp, curling around the edge of the well, pulling the rest of it into view. My mind refused to process what I was seeing, but I couldn't look away. It was me. The figure that crawled out of the well wore my face, my exact face, but distorted. Its skin was pale and smooth, almost waxy, its mouth stretched into a jagged grin that cut across its cheeks. Its eyes were empty voids, two perfect holes where light vanished completely. I stumbled back, my voice breaking into a strangled whisper. No, you're not me. It tilted its head to the side, the grin widening until it looked as though its face might split in two. I've been waiting for you, it said, in my voice, flat, emotionless, and so close it felt like the words came from inside my own skull. I shook my head, my hands curling into fists. You're lying. The thing stepped toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, its head twitching with every step. The ground beneath it turned black, veins of dark liquid seeping outward like ink spreading across paper. The whispers surrounded me now, deafening, overlapping into a chorus of voices that repeated the same word over and over. Remember. The world around me shifted. The clearing rippled like water, the trees stretching and bending into impossible angles, the sky swirling overhead. Images flashed through my mind, fragments of things I couldn't understand. Faces I didn't know, places I'd never been. A memory, or maybe a dream, of standing in front of this very well, looking down into the same red glow. The thing reached for me, its fingers inches from my chest, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. I turned and bolted toward the forest, my breath ragged, my vision blurring as the world tilted and spun around me. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, soft and slick, like I was running across a living thing. Behind me, I could hear it following, the faint scrape of its limbs, the whispering growing louder with every step. Come back, it called, its voice almost gentle now, but I didn't stop. I pushed deeper into the forest, the branches whipping at my face and arms, tearing my skin. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, but I kept running, faster and faster, until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to collapse beneath me. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A light. A single, golden beam cutting through the fog, filtering through the twisted branches like a beacon. My heart leapt in my chest, and I sprinted toward it, desperate for an escape, any escape. The light grew brighter as I ran, the whispers behind me fading into a low hum that seemed to tremble in the air. I burst through the tree line, stumbling onto solid ground, and collapsed. The hum stopped. The forest was gone. I looked up, gasping for breath. I was standing in front of the house again, the same house where this nightmare had started. The windows stared back at me like hollow eyes, the door slightly ajar, waiting. Behind me, the forest was silent. The air was still. I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling, and turned back toward the house. There was nowhere else to go. The front door creaked open as I approached, and I stepped inside. The air was cold and still, the scent of decay thick and heavy. The entryway was exactly as I remembered it, dusty and dark, the long wooden table standing in the center of the room. Except now, there was something on it. A mirror. It was small and round, its surface perfectly clean despite the dust covering everything else. I moved toward it slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the table, I looked down into the glass. I didn't see myself. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the thing from the well, its hollow eyes and jagged grin, its head tilted just slightly to the side. The whispering started again, soft and insistent, coming from the edges of the room. I lifted the mirror slowly, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, repeating the same phrase over and over, their voices overlapping until I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. It's you. It's always been you. I wanted to drop the mirror, to smash it against the floor, but I couldn't. My fingers were locked around the edges of the glass, my reflection staring back at me with that same awful grin. And then, slowly, the reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. So did I. The surface rippled beneath my touch, the room around me shuddering violently. The whispers turned into screams, hundreds of voices screaming my name, shaking the walls, shaking the world. My head felt like it was splitting open, my body locking in place as the glass melted beneath my fingertips, pulling me forward, into the dark. The road was empty for miles, just cracked asphalt under a dull gray sky and the shadow of the Rockies looming far to the west. Tom was at the wheel, white-knuckling the steering as if pressing harder might fix the sputtering engine. "She'll make it," he muttered under his breath. I sat in the back, legs cramped, my eyes glued to the fading GPS signal. For the last 20 minutes, the line had been leading us in circles, deep into nowhere. Sarah was the first to see it, Silent Creek. At least, that's what the half-rotted sign read. The letters were barely legible, through layers of grime and peeling paint. Below it, someone had scratched a word with what looked like rust or something far worse. "Go back." No one spoke as Tom eased the car down the main road. Houses lined both sides, skeletons of what they once were, wood warped from decades of neglect. Windows were either shattered or covered in dust so thick they looked opaque. The place was a ghost of a memory, the kind of town you only find in the dark corners of forgotten maps. The car shuddered and died in front of an old gas station. We climbed out, and the cold struck me like a slap. Silent Creek had an emptiness I couldn't explain. Even the wind felt wrong. It didn't whistle through the abandoned buildings. It whispered, low and deliberate, as if testing the weight of each word. Emma kicked a can near her foot, the metallic clatter echoing too loudly. "No signal," she grumbled, holding her phone high like that might summon a miracle. Jack and Tom were already walking toward the gas station. Maybe someone left a radio or a phone. I followed, my shoes scraping against loose gravel. The station was worse up close. The front windows had caved in, their jagged edges pointing outward as if something had escaped rather than entered. A sickly sweet smell hit me first. It was faint, but it clawed at the back of my throat. Inside, the shelves had long been looted. Cans and bottles sprawled across the floor like dead soldiers. Sunlight trickled through holes in the ceiling, casting sharp beams onto what remained of the counter. A rusted cash register sat there, its keys stuck down with age. Behind it, a faded map hung from the wall, torn and discolored. "Guys." Tom's voice was strangled. He was staring at the floor. At first, I didn't see it, but then the light shifted, and there it was, a trail of footprints. Not dust-covered, but fresh, as if someone had walked through the place just minutes before us. They led deeper into the station, disappearing into a doorway marked staff only. A weight settled in my chest, cold and heavy. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Jack, ever the fearless one, stepped forward and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, screaming in protest. The room beyond was dark, but not the kind of darkness you can fix with light. It felt alive, thick and inky, swallowing the air. Jack shined his flashlight into the void, and for a second, I thought I saw something move, a shape slinking back just beyond the beam. "We should go," Emma whispered. Her words hung in the still air, met only with silence. Jack's flashlight stuttered and died. "What the—" He smacked it against his palm, but the light refused to return. Something creaked, a slow, deliberate groan of wood bending under pressure. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The others heard it too. I saw their eyes dart to the far corner of the room. A figure stood there, barely visible in the shadows. It was still, too still, but I knew it was watching us. Every hair on my body stood on end. And then it moved. Not like a person. People don't slide across the floor without sound, without weight. It was closer before I realized it. Too close, its outline sharp and unnatural. My legs locked in place as it leaned forward, the faint outline of a face visible now, mouth open, jaw unhinged like a broken doll. Sarah screamed, and the sound jolted me awake. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her back into the gas station's main room. Jack and Tom stumbled out after us, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. "Get to the car," Tom shouted, but we all knew it wouldn't start. Whatever lived here, whatever thing was hiding in this rotting town, wasn't going to let us leave. As we bolted through the front door, I glanced back once, just once. Figure was at the window now, its face pressed against the glass, watching. It didn't follow us. It didn't need to. Somehow, I knew it was already ahead of us, waiting. We ran. My shoes slammed against the cracked asphalt, each step like a drumbeat against the silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't dare look back again, not after what I'd seen through that window. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out Sarah's frantic breaths beside me and the gravel crunching under Tom's boots. Silent Creek felt endless, every street identical. Rows of decaying houses that seemed to lean closer, as if whispering secrets to each other. The car sat ahead, lifeless and sun-bleached, exactly where we left it. I dove for the passenger door, yanking the handle so hard it almost snapped off. Tom scrambled into the driver's seat, twisting the keys. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then let out a long, wheezing death rattle. No, come on," Tom shouted, slamming the wheel with the heel of his hand. His knuckles were bone white. From somewhere behind us, a sound broke through the silence. A scraping, deliberate noise, like nails dragging over metal. I froze. It was closer than I expected. Too close. "Forget the car." Jack's voice cut through the haze in my mind. "We'll find somewhere to hide." We scattered, sprinting into the open street, but every building we passed felt worse than the last. My throat burned from breathing too hard, the air heavy and bitter. I could hear Sarah whispering prayers under her breath behind me, but it wasn't enough to drown out the footsteps. The footsteps, they didn't rush, didn't falter. They followed, slow and patient, as if toying with us. Jack stopped abruptly ahead, pointing toward the church, the one we'd passed earlier, its steeple leaning crooked like it might collapse at any second. There, come on. The church doors were barely hanging on their hinges, and we barreled through them with enough force to send wood splintering to the floor. Inside, the temperature dropped like a stone. My breath puffed out in thin clouds, and the smell hit me again, thick like mildew and something worse. Decay. Death. It clung to the back of my throat. We collapsed against the walls, gasping for breath. Tom sank down next to me, his hands trembling, though he tried to hide it. "What was that?" Emma whispered. Her voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the church. She was staring toward the doors, waiting, as if that thing might burst through at any second. "It's still out there," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "It's waiting." Sarah sat apart from us, cradling her knees to her chest. "It's not supposed to be real," she said quietly. "Places like this don't exist. They don't." But they did. Silent Creek wasn't just some forgotten town. Something had happened here, something terrible, and whatever it was had never really left. The thought of those fresh footprints in the gas station returned to me, cold and sharp. Someone, or something, was still here. Jack moved toward the pulpit, his flashlight sweeping over rows of pews coated in dust. "We need to find a way out of this town," he said. "Or at least figure out what the hell we're dealing with." His light caught something near the back wall. At first, it just looked like a sheet of fabric, draped carelessly over a large object. Then the beam hit the edges of a shape beneath it, tall and human-like. Jack hesitated, then moved closer, his boots echoing against the floorboards. The rest of us just watched, frozen. He reached out and pulled the cloth away. It was a statue. At least, I thought it was a statue. A figure carved of stone, its surface cracked and chipped with age. It was tall, hunched over, its hands covering its face as if shielding itself. But the longer I stared, the less it looked like stone. The texture, uneven, mottled, reminded me of something far more organic. "That's not a statue," Tom said softly, as if saying it any louder would bring it to life. And he was right. The details were too precise, the curve of the knuckles, the way the skin seemed to wrinkle and fold under its own weight. Whoever, or whatever, this had been, it hadn't been carved. It had been preserved. I stepped back. My heel hit something solid and I nearly screamed. Spinning around, I saw another figure, this one smaller, curled into a fetal position near the front pew. Its face was turned toward me, mouth frozen open in a soundless cry. We weren't alone here. This place, this church, was full of them. Jack's flashlight flickered, sputtered, and then went out completely. Darkness dropped over us like a curtain. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then came the whispering. It started soft, so quiet I thought I imagined it. But it grew louder, a chorus of voices layered over each other, chanting something I couldn't understand. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. From the darkness, a noise broke through the whispers. An awful, guttural crack, like something shifting after lying still for too long. "Run," Jack shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled blindly toward the doors, my hands outstretched, searching for something solid. Behind me, I heard the sharp scrape of stone against wood and a sound I will never forget, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. The doors were still ajar, light spilling in from the stormy sky outside. I tore through them, gasping as the cold air hit me. Jack, Sarah, and Tom were right behind me, their faces pale, eyes wide. From inside the church came the sound of splintering wood, the doors groaning louder than before. I turned just in time to see something, a shape barely visible through the dust and shadow, crawling toward us. Not walking, crawling. The whispers followed us outside, still audible even as we fled into the empty streets. The town seemed different now. The buildings leaned closer, their jagged windows staring like empty eyes. The road ahead twisted in ways that didn't make sense, and no matter how far we ran, the church's crooked steeple loomed behind us, as if we'd never left. Silent Creek wouldn't let us go. It was waking up, and it was hungry. We didn't stop running until the church was a distant silhouette behind us, the crooked steeple barely visible through the shifting mist. The town stretched out before us, endless and unchanging, like we were trapped in a loop of rotting wood and crumbling stone. My chest burned with every breath. My heart beat a frantic drum roll, pounding in my ears. I wiped my sweat-slicked face with shaking hands, my mind replaying what I'd seen, those figures in the dark, crawling toward us. I didn't dare say it out loud, but I knew what they were. They weren't statues. They were people, left to decay into something unnatural. Jack slowed to a halt, bent over with his hands on his knees. We need to stop, he gasped. We can't keep running forever. Tom leaned against a rusted lamppost, his face pale and blotchy. Did you see that? What were they? His voice broke on the last word. I didn't know how to answer. None of us did. Sarah stood a few feet away, hugging herself, staring into the fog that seemed to press closer with every second. It doesn't matter, Jack said finally, straightening up. His voice was steadier than mine would have been. We're getting out of here. There's got to be something, a way out of town, a map, something. Maybe back in the forest, Emma said quietly. Her voice wavered like she didn't want to suggest it. The trail we saw earlier, the one by the gas station, it might lead somewhere. I wanted to argue. Going back into the woods felt like a death sentence, but as I looked around, I realized the alternative wasn't much better. The streets of Silent Creek were closing in on us, the houses shifting somehow, leaning inward as if listening, watching. Staying here wasn't an option. Fine, I said. We head for the woods, but we stick together. No one goes off alone. Got it? We moved quickly, cutting through side streets that all looked the same. Every house was a mirror of the last. Rotting porches, shattered windows, front doors half open, like mouths frozen mid-scream. Shadows lingered just out of sight, shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The fog was thicker now, a living thing slithering between us, muffling our footsteps. The forest appeared like a jagged tear at the edge of town. Blackened trees stretched upward, skeletal and lifeless, their branches twisted into shapes that looked too much like hands. The trail we'd seen before snaked through them, a thin line of dirt cutting through the undergrowth. I hesitated at the tree line. The forest felt wrong, hungry, almost as if it had been waiting for us. You sure about this? Tom asked, his voice tight. No, I admitted. But we don't have a choice. The first step onto the path felt like crossing some invisible line. The forest swallowed the little light left in the sky, plunging us into shadows that thickened the farther we went. The air was colder here, damp and heavy. It clung to my skin, worming its way into my lungs like a poison I couldn't exhale. The silence was worse. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. There was no rustling, no birds, no light. Just our footsteps, loud and intrusive, like we were disturbing something ancient. Somewhere ahead, Sarah stumbled. She let out a sharp cry, and we turned to find her on the ground, staring at something in the dirt. Jack shined his flashlight down, and the beam caught it, a hole. No, not just a hole. A pit carved into the earth, the edges jagged and unnatural, as if something had clawed its way out. It goes down forever, Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. She was right. The pit stretched into absolute blackness, and the longer I stared, the more I swore I could hear something, a sound rising from below. It was faint at first, a soft murmur like voices just out of reach. Then it grew, building into a low, rhythmic chant. The words were unintelligible, but they crawled inside my head and settled there like parasites. "Move," Jack said, pulling Sarah back. "Don't look at it. Keep walking." But there were more. Dozens of them. Pits like wounds scattered throughout the forest floor. The chanting grew louder as we moved, echoing in every direction, until I couldn't tell if it was coming from above or below. I kept my eyes fixed on the path, forcing myself not to look down into those endless holes. Tom was the first to hear it, the footsteps behind us. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We froze. The forest pressed in around us, and the whispering seemed to stop, like it was listening too. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then one of those shadows moved. A figure stepped into view between the trees. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and bent at impossible angles. It didn't walk so much as it shifted, each movement wrong, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world. "Go," Jack said, his voice shaking. "No." We ran, the forest blurring around us. The chanting returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices layered together, rising to a fever pitch. My flashlight bounced wildly, catching glimpses of more figures moving between the trees. They were everywhere now, shapes that twitched and crawled, closing in on us. The path ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center, the ground had collapsed into a massive crater, wider than any of the pits we'd seen. A foul stench rose from it, thick and choking, and the chanting became deafening. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my skull. Behind us, the figures emerged from the trees, their faces obscured by shadow, their limbs moving with jerking, unnatural precision. One of them stepped forward, its mouth splitting open in a silent scream. I felt it then, the pull, a force dragging me toward the crater, stronger than anything I could fight. My legs moved on their own, stumbling closer to the edge. "Don't look," Jack shouted, grabbing my arm. His voice cut through the fog in my mind, snapping me back. I pulled away from the edge, gasping. The others were already running, and I forced my legs to move, dragging myself away from whatever waited below. We didn't stop until the trees thinned, and the fog gave way to a faint sliver of twilight. Silent Creek was still there, waiting for us, but something had changed. The forest had let us go, for now. But as I turned back, I saw them standing at the tree line, those figures watching, unmoving, waiting, and I knew we were out of time. Silent Creek wasn't going to let us leave. The mist curled at our feet as we stumbled back into Silent Creek. My chest heaved with every breath, and my legs felt like lead, dragging me forward step by step. Jack had taken the lead again, flashlight flickering weakly in his trembling hands, while Sarah followed close behind, her wide eyes darting from shadow to shadow, like she expected something to reach out and grab her. I couldn't blame her. I felt it too, that weight in the air, the suffocating sense of being watched. We didn't speak. The only sounds were our shoes scraping over cracked pavement and the faint hum of the forest behind us, like it was still alive, whispering in a language we couldn't understand. I tried to focus on the buildings ahead, but they'd changed, or maybe I was finally seeing them for what they really were. The houses leaned together like they were conspiring, their broken windows reflecting nothing but darkness. Shapes moved behind some of them, silent and slow, their outlines too vague to recognize. I wiped sweat from my face with the back of my hand. I couldn't shake the memory of the pit, of what I'd felt standing at its edge. It was more than just the pull. It was the sense of something looking back at me, something waiting. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if Jack hadn't grabbed me. The church loomed ahead, its crooked steeple stabbing upward like a jagged tooth against the bruised sky. Jack stopped in front of it, turning to face the rest of us. "We can't keep running blind," he said, his voice rough and low. "There has to be something here, a way out, or at least an answer." "What answers?" Tom muttered. "You saw those things. This place isn't normal. None of this is." Jack ignored him. "We missed something in the church. There has to be a reason all this started there." I wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at me to stay as far away from that building as possible. But he was right. We didn't have a plan. The car was dead. The woods were alive with things that weren't supposed to exist. Silent Creek was a labyrinth, one that twisted and turned until you lost yourself completely. So, against every ounce of better judgment, I nodded. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "Let's go." We stepped inside. The church was worse than I remembered. The air was colder here, carrying the sharp, coppery tang of something old and rotten. I kept close to Sarah, our footsteps muffled against the dust-caked floorboards. My flashlight caught glimpses of the statues, figures frozen mid-anguish, hands shielding their faces or clutching their own throats. I tried not to look at them, but I could feel their presence pressing in on me. It was like they were still aware somehow, even in their silence. Jack moved ahead, his beam sweeping the pulpit. "There," he said, pointing. The trapdoor. The trapdoor was just behind the pulpit, partially hidden beneath a rotting rug. Jack knelt and pried it open, the wood groaning in protest. The smell that rushed up was suffocating, worse than anything we'd encountered before. It reeked of mold, damp earth, and something I couldn't quite name, a smell that clawed its way into my sinuses and refused to leave. "Do we have to go down there?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled, barely audible. Jack didn't answer. He just swung the flashlight down into the opening. The light disappeared after a few feet, swallowed by shadows that seemed too thick to be natural. "There is something down there," he said, more to himself than to us. "Maybe answers, maybe a way out." Without waiting, he dropped down into the darkness. "Jack!" I hissed. I leaned over the edge, my flashlight flickering down into the gloom. I could barely see him, just the faint bounce of his beam moving through what looked like a stone passage. He called back, his voice muffled. "It's safe. I think it's some kind of basement. You need to see this." I didn't want to go down. I really didn't. But Jack's voice echoed strangely, almost vibrating in the air, like something deeper was speaking with him. The thought of leaving him down there alone pushed me to the edge of the trapdoor. I glanced at Sarah and Tom Ball. "We stick together. Come on." One by one, we climbed down the ladder. My boots hit stone, the cold seeping up through the soles and into my bones. The basement stretched out before us, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone. The ceiling was low, forcing us to hunch slightly as we moved forward. Water dripped from somewhere unseen, the sound distant and hollow. Jack's flashlight swept across the floor, stopping at something halfway down the passage. "Look," he said, his voice cracking. I stepped closer, my beam falling over the same spot. Symbols had been carved into the floor, crude and ancient, their lines etched deep into the stone. They stretched out in a circular pattern, filling the entire room. In the center sat an altar. No, not an altar, a table, made of blackened wood, its surface scarred and stained. Something metallic glinted faintly in the light, half hidden beneath a layer of grime. A knife, long and jagged, the blade rusted but still sharp. Sarah gagged. "What is this?" Jack crouched, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "It's a ritual. This whole place, it's a ritual site." A low sound echoed through the tunnel then, freezing me in place. It was deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. My flashlight dimmed suddenly, flickering as the air grew colder. I looked at the passage we'd come through, but it was gone. Swallowed by blackness that seemed alive, shifting and writhing like it was moving toward us. Something thudded in the darkness. Footsteps. Tom stumbled back, his breath ragged. It's here. It's coming. The heartbeat grew louder, faster. The symbols on the floor seemed to shimmer, the lines bleeding red like fresh wounds. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the ladder. Move. Get out. We bolted. The tunnel behind us roared with sound, the footsteps crashing like thunder now, so close they shook the walls. My flashlight barely worked, the beam guttering like it was suffocating under the weight of the dark. Jack climbed first, his hands slipping against the ladder's rusted rungs. Sarah went next, then Tom. I waited until they were almost clear, the noise rising to a deafening pitch behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something huge was in that tunnel, its presence pressing against my back like a physical weight. It was inches away, reaching, stretching. I scrambled up the ladder, the metal cutting into my palms, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. We burst back into the church in a heap, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. The sound stopped, like someone had cut a cord, leaving the air thin and dead. I lay there on the floor, chest heaving, the scent of rot still thick in my nostrils. Jack sat up, his face pale, his hands stained red with dirt. Sarah's voice broke the silence, low and shaking. We can't stay here. She was right. Whatever was down there, whatever had been waiting in the dark, it wasn't done with us. And now, it knew we were here. The air inside the church felt heavier now, like it was trying to crush us where we sat. I could still hear it, the sound, that rhythmic, deafening pulse from below, pounding through the trapdoor like it might burst through any second. It wasn't over. Whatever we disturbed in that tunnel, it was awake now, and it was waiting. Jack sat against the far wall, the flashlight limp in his hands. He hadn't said a word since we climbed out of the basement, his face pale and streaked with grime. Tom paced near the shattered windows, glancing out into the thickening fog that had crept closer to the church. His breathing was sharp and uneven, and I didn't blame him. Sarah was huddled in a pew, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes locked on the trapdoor, as if expecting it to fly open at any second. I sat in the middle of it all, staring at my own filthy hands. My palms still stung from gripping the ladder too hard, rust and dirt ground into the cuts. I could feel the shaking in my arms, the adrenaline wearing thin. I didn't dare speak. It felt like words would shatter the fragile silence we'd managed to crawl into. Tom finally broke it, his voice raw. We can't stay here. We have to. He paused, looking for the words. We have to do something. You all saw those symbols. That place, this town isn't just abandoned. There's something here, something real. His words stirred something in Jack, who looked up sharply, his eyes dark and hollow. You think I don't know that? He pushed himself to his feet, the flashlight flickering back to life as he moved. You think I don't hear it? Feel it? He gestured toward the trapdoor. It's everywhere. Whatever this is, it's not going to let us walk away. It's already inside our heads. I swallowed hard. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The sound hadn't left me, not entirely. It pulsed in the back of my mind like a faint echo, just loud enough to remind me it was still there. I looked at Sarah. You've been quiet. Did you see something down there? She blinked, startled, as if I'd pulled her out of a trance. Slowly, she nodded. It wasn't just a ritual, she whispered. It was a sacrifice. Those symbols, they weren't just carved there to be seen. They were made to contain something. Contain what? Tom snapped. Whatever's down there is already loose. Did you see the way it moved? Like the whole tunnel was alive. It was wrong. Not loose, Sarah interrupted softly, shaking her head. It's still trapped, but it's trying to get out. Those things, the figures in the forest, the ones in the tunnel, they're part of it. Pieces of whatever's buried here. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I thought of the pits, how the ground had split open like wounds scattered through the forest. I thought of the pull I'd felt at the edge of the crater, the way the dark had seemed to breathe. Something wasn't just buried here. It was spreading. Then we need to find a way to stop it, I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. My voice echoed strangely in the empty church. If those symbols were meant to hold it in, maybe there's a way to reinforce them. Jack's flashlight swept over the trapdoor again, his face twisted in thought. We'll need to go back down there. The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. None of us wanted to go back, not after what we'd seen, what we'd felt. But what choice did we have? If we ran, Silent Creek would just pull us back. I'd seen the way the streets shifted, the forest twisted to keep us trapped. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just in Silent Creek. It was Silent Creek. And if we didn't stop it here, we'd never escape. Jack moved first, pulling the trapdoor open again. The stench poured out worse than before, like the earth itself was rotting. I grabbed Sarah's arm gently as she stood, her face pale and strained. "We'll be okay," I lied. "We'll fix this." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. One by one, we descended into the dark. The tunnel felt different this time, alive, almost pulsing, like it was breathing with us. My flashlight barely cut through the black, the beam shaking as I moved it across the walls. The symbols glistened faintly now, their grooves oozing something dark and sticky. I tried not to look too closely at it. The smell was worse here, sharp and coppery, clinging to my skin like oil. We stopped at the center of the chamber, the altar looming ahead like a jagged shadow. Jack knelt down and ran his fingers over the symbols carved into the floor, muttering to himself. "We need something to seal it, something that'll bind it back." Tom stared at him like he was insane. "And what, exactly, do you think we're supposed to use? You don't just throw salt on something like this and call it a day." "It's blood." We all turned to Sarah. She stood rigid, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her voice was flat, hollow. "The ritual, the symbols were made with blood. That's why they're alive. It's the only way to reinforce them." The air seemed to thin around us, and I felt a cold wave of dread crawl up my spine. "You can't be serious." But Jack didn't argue. He pulled a knife from his pocket, a short, sharp blade that glinted in the light, and drew it across his palm before any of us could stop him. He winced as the blood welled up, dripping onto the nearest symbol. The reaction was immediate. The lines hissed and glowed faintly, as if drinking in the offering. "Do it," Jack said through gritted teeth. "All of you." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that altar as possible. But there was nowhere to go. Silent Creek would find us, and whatever was waiting beneath our feet was clawing closer to the surface. If this was the only way to hold it back, I had to try. I took the knife from Jack, the metal slick with his blood, and pressed it against my palm. The symbols burned brighter, the light crawling across the floor like veins of fire. The heartbeat returned, louder now, shaking the walls around us. The ground trembled, and the air grew so heavy I thought it might crush me where I stood. The light spread, pooling around the altar, until the chamber was bathed in crimson. Then it stopped. The light dimmed. The trembling ceased. The sound was gone. We stood there in silence, our breathing loud and ragged. My palm burned, and the blood still dripped from my fingers, but I didn't care. The darkness around us felt quieter. Still. "It worked," Sarah whispered. But as we turned to climb back to the surface, I heard it. A sound so faint, I almost missed it. A crack. And then laughter. Low, guttural laughter, echoing up from somewhere far, far below. The laughter crept up through the cracks in the earth, vibrating in my chest like a hum that had no end. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to sound like it was buried miles below. But that somehow made it worse. It wasn't mocking us. It wasn't angry. It was hungry. "Get out," Jack said, his voice so low I almost didn't hear him. He didn't look at us, just at the altar, where the symbols now glowed faintly, their light flickering like dying embers. "We need to get out. Now." No one argued. We turned as one, the passage narrowing and pressing in tighter around us than before. I could still hear it beneath my feet, the sound threading through the cracks and spreading out like roots. The ground felt soft, like it was shifting under my boots. I gripped the ladder with trembling hands and climbed, my arms weak, the cuts on my palms stinging as I went. I was the last to climb out, and the moment my head broke the surface, Sarah and Tom slammed the trapdoor shut. Dust billowed up in choking clouds, filling the air with the sick sweet scent of rot. Jack stood in the center of the church, his flashlight bouncing in his grip as he stared at the floor. I followed his gaze. The trapdoor was pulsing, slowly, like the heartbeat we'd heard in the tunnels had followed us up and settled just beneath the wood. "What do we do now?" Tom's voice cracked, sweat dripping down his face. "You heard that thing. You felt it." No one answered. Jack paced in tight, frantic circles, his boots thudding too loudly against the church floor. His flashlight swayed wildly, scattering light across the darkened room. I could still hear the faint rumble beneath us, like it was moving, growing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The quiet didn't last. A sharp, deafening bang rang out from the far end of the church, the echo rattling the walls. I flinched, the sound splintering straight through my chest like a knife. My flashlight flicked to the back wall, just in time to see it. A door I hadn't noticed before, warped and crooked, rattling violently on its hinges. Something was behind it, pushing. "We need to leave." Sarah's voice was tight and thin, but she didn't move. None of us did. The sound of the door grew louder, shaking the entire wall with every hit. Dust rained down in thin, choking clouds. Another hit, harder this time, and the wood split down the center like kindling. Whatever it was coming through. "Move!" Jack shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and dragging her toward the front doors. Tom and I followed, but the church was fighting us. I swear it was. The pews seemed to shift as we ran, twisting in ways that didn't make sense, like the building itself was alive and trying to trap us. The front doors wouldn't budge. I threw myself against them, my shoulder screaming in protest as the wood refused to give way. Behind me, the sound of the splintering door grew louder, closer. I could feel it pressing against me, like the air had turned to liquid. "Help me!" I shouted. Jack joined me, both of us slamming against the doors with everything we had. The hinges groaned. One more hit and the doors flew open, a wall of mist swallowing us as we tumbled outside. The moment my feet hit the ground, I felt it. Silent Creek was different now. The fog was thicker, swirling in angry, churning currents, pressing against my skin like it was trying to seep inside. The streets no longer looked real. Houses leaned at impossible angles, their windows dark and yawning. The trees that bordered the edge of the town twisted and stretched upward, their branches clawing at the sky. There was no wind, no sound, but I could feel something moving beneath it all. Watching, waiting. Jack grabbed my arm. "We need to find the tunnels again. The mines. If the symbols can't hold that thing, we'll bury it." "What?" I stared at him. "You want to go back underground? Are you insane?" "We don't have a choice." Jack's voice cracked. "You saw what's happening. It's spreading. If we don't stop at this place, it won't stop with Silent Creek. It'll spread like a disease. You think it'll let us leave?" His words hung in the air, sharp and cold, and I realized he was right. Silent Creek wouldn't let us go, not while that thing was waking up. We ran. The streets bent and twisted beneath us, turning sharp corners that shouldn't have existed, leading us deeper into the town. I didn't know if we were heading toward the mines or running straight into a trap, but it didn't matter. I could hear it now, everywhere. The heartbeat, the laughter. The ground trembled beneath us like it was alive, breathing with us, matching our steps. The entrance to the mines was worse than I'd imagined. A gaping maw carved into the earth, framed by rusted tracks that vanished into absolute darkness. The mist clung to the opening, curling inward like it was being sucked inside. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a lantern hanging by the old entrance and lit it with shaking hands, the flame flickering weakly, as if the darkness was trying to swallow it whole. "Stay close," he muttered. "And don't stop." We stepped into the mine, the tunnel walls closing around us like a fist. The deeper we went, the more the sound changed. It wasn't just a heartbeat anymore. It was breathing. Low, guttural, and constant. My flashlight skimmed across old beams and rusted tools, but the shadows twisted around the light, moving on their own. Something wasn't right. The air felt thicker here, and the lantern flame barely flickered now. It was as if the darkness was pressing against us, trying to smother the light. And then I saw it. Carved into the rock at the end of the tunnel was another symbol, massive this time, stretching floor to ceiling, its lines jagged and imperfect. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. "It's not sealed," Sarah whispered. Her voice cracked as she pointed to the center of the symbol. A crack split through it, wide and deep, oozing that same dark substance from the church basement. It dripped like tar, hissing when it touched the ground. "It's breaking," Jack said. "We're running out of time." Before I could respond, the tunnel trembled. The ground split beneath my feet, knocking me onto my back. My flashlight skittered away, its beam cutting wildly through the dark. From the crack in the symbol, something began to rise. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadows peeled away, and a shape emerged, tall and unnatural, its limbs too long, its body shifting like smoke caught in a storm. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. And for the first time, the whispering turned to words, low, rasping, and terrible. "You woke me up. Now you belong to me." The words echoed through the mine, vibrating in the air like they carried a weight I couldn't understand. My skin went cold, the hair on the back of my neck rising. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the shape pulling itself free from the crack in the stone. Its form was shifting, smoke and shadow 1 second, flesh and bone the next. It twisted unnaturally, unfolding limbs that seemed endless, bending in ways that no living thing should. I still couldn't see its face, but I felt it watching me, its presence a pressure that tightened around my chest like a vice. "Jack!" I gasped, my voice breaking. "We need to go." Jack was frozen, lantern trembling in his hands, the dim light flickering uselessly against the shape that towered over us. Sarah pulled at his sleeve, her voice high and panicked. "Jack, please, move!" It took a second for him to snap out of it, but then he grabbed the lantern and started backing up. Tom was already pulling Sarah toward the entrance, and I stumbled after them, my legs numb and weak. The creature's voice, if you could even call it a voice, rumbled from the depths of the tunnel, vibrating through the rock, through me. It didn't shout or scream. It whispered, low and guttural, the words soaked in something ancient and hateful. "You will never leave." The tunnel began to shake. Dust and bits of rock rained down from the ceiling, and the air grew impossibly heavy, making it hard to breathe. I looked back just once, just a glimpse, and I saw it. The shadows crawled across the floor and walls, snaking toward us like living veins, reaching with fingers that stretched and clawed for my feet. The thing moved, its form gliding closer, its limbs dragging with an awful scrape that made my stomach twist. "Run!" I shouted, though I could barely hear myself over the roaring sound that filled the tunnel. It was everywhere, like the earth itself was screaming. The mine was collapsing around us, beams splintering, the walls cracking open like a wound. I kept my head down, pushing forward as fast as I could. I could hear the others just ahead. Sarah's sobs, Tom's strained breathing, Jack shouting something I couldn't make out. And then I felt it. The cold. It started at my feet, a numbing chill that spread up my legs like ice water. I risked a glance behind me, and the shadows were there, crawling over the ground, spreading like a wave of darkness, swallowing everything. Go, go, go. Jack's voice cut through the noise, and I saw him and Tom pull Sarah up through the mouth of the mine, their silhouettes barely visible in the thick, swirling fog outside. I lunged for the entrance, the cold at my heels, the shadows brushing against the soles of my shoes. My fingers scraped against the rock as I pulled myself free. The moment my feet hit solid ground, I collapsed onto the dirt, chest heaving, lungs burning. Behind me, the mine let out a deafening groan, the earth splitting wide as the tunnel caved in. A cloud of dust and smoke burst from the entrance, carrying with it the sound, the heartbeat, the whispers, the laughter, until all that remained was silence. I sat up slowly, coughing, my eyes stinging. Jack was on his knees, staring at the collapsed entrance, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. Tom was slumped against a tree, his head tipped back, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Sarah sat a few feet away, curled into herself, shaking. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the mist, now eerily quiet, swirling around the edge of the forest like it was retreating. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe we'd sealed it, buried whatever that thing was back in the dark where it belonged. But Silent Creek didn't feel empty. It didn't feel finished. Jack stood first, his movements slow and stiff. He looked down at his bloody hands, the cuts on his palms still oozing, and then at the mine entrance, where dust was settling over the ruined ground. "Did we stop it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. No one answered. I didn't have an answer. It felt like we'd escaped something bigger than we could understand, something that wasn't bound by rules we could see. I glanced toward the town, where the fog hung thick and still. The houses were waiting, dark and silent, their broken windows like empty eyes. "We need to leave," I said quietly, forcing myself to stand. My legs felt like they might buckle, but I pushed through it. "The car, maybe we can get it running. We have to try." Sarah looked at me, her face pale and hollow. "It won't let us leave," she whispered. "You know that, don't you?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't want to believe it. We moved through the forest as quickly as we could, every step pulling us farther from the mine, farther from whatever waited in the dark. But the woods were different now. The trees leaned closer, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to close us in. The path we'd followed earlier was gone, swallowed by roots and overgrowth that hadn't been there before. I could feel the town behind us, pressing against my back like a shadow that wouldn't leave. By the time we stumbled out of the woods and back onto the main road, the car was still there. It looked smaller now, fragile, and out of place in a world that had started to unravel. Jack climbed into the driver's seat, shoving the keys into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine turned over once, twice. For a second, it felt like Silent Creek would win. Then, with a sputtering growl, the car came to life. We didn't look back as we drove. None of us spoke. The road twisted and stretched in ways I couldn't remember, the fog curling just beyond the edges of the headlights, always there, always watching. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it, the shape, the shadows, something following us. But there was nothing, just darkness. Hours passed, maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The road finally straightened, and the fog broke apart, fading into nothing. The mountains rose up on either side, the sky lightening to a dull gray as the first hints of morning crept over the horizon. We didn't stop until we hit the edge of a small gas station miles away from Silent Creek. Jack killed the engine. None of us moved. Tom was the first to speak, his voice a ragged whisper. "Is it over?" I didn't answer. I just sat there, staring at the dirt-caked windshield, the dried blood on my hands. The silence was wrong somehow, too quiet. I could still hear it in the back of my mind, that faint whisper, threading through the cracks. When I finally looked into the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. There, far down the road, just visible in the pale light of dawn, the fog was still there.